Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So my name is Jason Knutzen. Thank you, Pascal, for leading us in. And so, yeah, you're stuck with me here for a little bit. So in this seminar, we're going to be going over a lot of the common questions I know that Extension's been getting for a while, and I assume you, as students or people interested in cameras, have been thinking about as well, of how can I, or what should I get, how much should I spend, is it smart to buy a camera, should I rent, all the different questions that go with the idea of getting a camera to start your career. Now, to start your film career might be a little misleading. So if you're coming to this seminar expecting to hear a lot about Kodak and Fuji and 35 millimeter and 16 millimeter film, sorry, you're about 20 years too late. So what we're focusing on mostly today is all digital, because this is where we really are in the industry right now, especially for cinematographers, especially for young cinematographers. Understanding the concepts of digital and digital cinematography is crucial. So what we're going to be going over today is, we'll talk about what the current cameras are, what's new, what's interesting, what might be a good buy, what might be the different levels. Can you really get an Arri Alexa? Maybe, probably not. So we'll go over what all those different things are, but the first portion of the class, what I really want to do is go over some of the more creative and technical aspects of what really makes a camera, because that for me is the most important part, rather than just thinking of it like, oh, I need a RED. I hear the RED's a really great camera, it shoots 8K, 12K, 24K, who knows. And is that really important? So we'll talk about what the Ks really mean when it comes to cameras. I know if you go on like a website like B&H or Best Buy or some of these other places that sell cameras, they have that spec sheet, the spec sheet that goes over the different aspects of the camera. And I know for a lot of people, that can be really daunting. So we'll go over what some of those concepts are that you might see on a spec sheet. So if you're trying to compare a couple different cameras, at least it kind of gives you a good jumping off point to know what those different aspects are. So we'll go over all that and then some, and I'll try not to get too technical, but we'll kind of keep a nice balance here. So Pascal gave me a little intro of stuff. So I'm a cinematographer, shot a handful of features, color corrected a lot more features. So part of my day-to-day stuff working in color correction is that I'm getting footage coming in all the time from different cameras shot by different cinematographers. So the big cool aspect of that is I'm working with this footage all the time. So for me, that's really one of the most important parts of a camera, is how that footage is ultimately being worked with in post, in color correction. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into the seminar itself. Okay, so without further ado, let's kind of start to jump into it. So I have my slides here that'll kind of like guide me along. When I do my classes for UCLA, it's very common that I get stuck down these deep, dark rabbit holes that we just start going on different concepts. So the PowerPoints for me are really kind of a great way to refocus what we're supposed to be talking about. So those will help keep me on point, and then we'll also put them up full screen for you as well in case you want to take notes or follow along on your own. Okay, so when we're talking about investing in a camera and what the camera actually is, this comes down to the core of cinematography. So I know most of this we're kind of be approaching from the idea of cinematography, which is the person on set, the cinematographer, who is in charge of camera and lighting and one of the best collaborators with a director for visual storytelling. So I know some of you might not be in the film industry per se, or want to eventually be in the film industry. So I'm going to try to broach both sides of the equation. So there's cinematographers, which is for more, your film, TV production, more of the professional side of filmmaking. And then there's also videographers. Videographers can be cinematographers, but videographers are people who are more just shooting video for the sake of generating content. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. I know probably a good number of you consider yourselves videographers, people who maybe have a camera, have shot some stuff before. So that side of it is equally as important, because there's so much content being created right now. Even if you look at stuff like social media, all of that requires a camera. So what camera might factor into that side of things as well. So all of that we'll try to broach here in the seminar, and leave plenty of time for questions. Because a big thing I can think of is that everyone's kind of approaching this from different aspects. So if I don't touch on something that's directly relevant to you, feel free to use the questions to type a question like, hey, this is what I do. Can you recommend a camera for this or that? And then if we have time there at the end, I will do my best to try and answer these questions and help you as best as possible in your specific case. So back to what we're supposed to be talking about. See, rabbit holes. I told you. We start going down, 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 down. Where it ends, who knows? But camera choice, like cinematography, a blend of art and craft. So the art of cinematography. This is what ultimately makes film an art form, right? At the end of the day, filmmakers are artists. So how you express your art, right? A screenwriter through a script, a director through working with actors, a cinematographer through creating expressive visuals that all tell a story. Everyone is working towards this greater goal of visual storytelling. So because of that, the camera is the essential tool of visual storytelling. So that's what's most important to keep in mind when you're thinking about what camera is right for me, which camera is best suited to help you tell your story. It's easy to get sucked into the tech, the craft side of camera choice. Is it 4K, 8K? Well, you know what? No one's ever watched a great movie and thought, wow, I wonder how many Ks that movie is, right? It doesn't happen. So beyond just thinking of the Ks and the tech, you have to think of the camera as a creative tool of visual storytelling. Okay, so as we start to transition into this idea of, do I need to buy a camera or should I buy a camera, all of that, this is kind of a good question because owning a camera, and I mean, I just talked about all the beauty and the art of cinematography and visual storytelling. Now we got to buckle down and talk a little bit about business because buying a camera is a major investment. So you are investing in your career as a filmmaker. Now, everyone's, especially in the times we currently are, everyone's financial situation, especially in the artistic field, varies quite dramatically, especially over the last challenging year. So I know the idea of potentially investing in a camera right now might be challenging for some people. But if you are looking to make that investment, you need to approach it as much of a business decision as possible, especially with the higher end cameras. We'll get into talking about those, and we're looking at price ranges in the 5 to 6 figures for some of these cameras. So this is not just like a quick, easy purchase type of thing. So when you're looking to buy a camera, also ask yourself the question, does it make sense to rent a camera? So if we're looking to rent a camera instead of buy, how can you start to go about that? Because renting a camera is a great possibility when it comes down to evaluating which camera is the best for you. I've actually done that myself in looking at buying a camera, that I went and rented from a couple different places, tried out a couple different systems to see what the best possible solution is. So when you're looking to rent, there are a couple different options out there depending on where you're located. So the actual camera rental itself, there's sites like lensrentals.com that can be great options. There's other options like Sammy's Camera if you're here in Los Angeles. Different camera rental places depending on where you live are all potentials for renting. So when you're looking to invest in a camera, something like that, renting might be a great option to try out a different camera to see if that's the right right camera for yourself. So some rental options, one that distributes around the entire United States is lensrentals.com. Now, I've gone through them before for different projects, especially if I'm traveling to go shoot. They can actually ship you camera gear to your location. You use it, you put it back in a box, they ship it back to you. It's a pretty great little setup. But there are other rental options probably around you. I know in Los Angeles, at least, Sammy's Camera, some photography shops. I think in New York as well, B&H has some rentals. Film Tools here in Los Angeles as well. So all of these are potential options for renting and trying out cameras. Now, there might be professional cinema rental houses around where you are. So in that case, you could look into options there as well. The only thing I would caution with these professional rental houses is that most of them require high-end insurance, production insurance, to help protect their equipment and things like that. So for you to get that insurance is a pretty expensive endeavor. So that might be something to keep in mind if you're trying to go through a professional rental house. But some of these camera places like lensrentals.com and others are really great options for trying out a couple different formats on smaller shoots. And then if it's something you really enjoy and love and want to invest in, you certainly have that option to buy later on. So renting, buying, trying, all these are good options. But when you think about buying a camera, it's a lot more than just the camera body itself. Because a camera body also needs this kind of crucial element, a lens. So with a lens, right, lenses are really, for me, the best place to invest money right away, because lenses will stand for a much longer period of time. The question with cameras themselves is that they do have sort of a shelf life. If you've been following some of the news and announcements from some of the major camera manufacturers, you'll realize that things change over pretty quickly when it comes to new cameras, new camera announcements, new camera bodies. Now we're cutting the price of this, we're introducing that. So it can be quite a race to try and keep up with what's current and what's new. So for me, the way I think about it is if I'm investing in a camera, the best case scenario for that camera to really be kind of state of the art is maybe 2 to 3 years, really. So it's a little scary when you're looking at 5 to 6 figure investments on something that has that amount of shelf life. So we'll talk more about that as we get into the later cameras, but something that lasts much longer than 2 to 3 years, lenses. So the lens you put on your camera, that is almost as equally as important an area of visual aesthetics, visual optics, and something I go into in some of my extension classes where we actually test different lenses and kind of break down what the visual characteristics are of those lenses. That's really cool and interesting, but that's certainly an area you can look to invest in as well. And then all the other stuff that comes with a camera. We're talking about batteries, memory cards, tripods, different accessories, monitors, all this stuff that adds up quickly. Now, the good news with batteries and cards and all this other stuff is it will last beyond just that one camera in most instances. You'll be able to use that camera, use those accessories on future cameras as well. So it could be an investment that lasts a bit longer, but you're gonna need a lot of those types of things to make your camera work to begin with. Now, another concept to think about, these different circumstances for different filmmakers. So how are you approaching the use of this camera in your own career, right? If you're a narrative filmmaker, you probably want something that could have the high resolution that's great for post-production work as well, for color correction, potential visual effects, all the different aspects that go into narrative storytelling. If you're in documentary, you're gonna want something that probably has very long record times. Most documentaries shoot tons and tons, hours upon hours of footage. So compression and memory card space and internal record settings, all of those are going to be really important for a documentary filmmaker. And then the other sides of it, like just beyond narrative and documentary, if you just like making videos, right? On the weekend with your friends, you're going out just filming cool stuff. I know I have a couple friends who like to skateboard and they make skateboard videos. So that's a completely different aspect of filmmaking. So what camera's right for them? Is it something that's, you know, a 5-6 figure investment? No, they're looking for something that's small, portable, can get great moving and tracking shots. So how you approach a camera, you have to kind of think about how you're going to use it and start to kind of make your wish list of what you want that camera to do for you. Okay, so what is really the perfect camera, right? The perfect camera is all about how you plan to use it, like I was just talking about. Cameras for play versus cameras for work. So if this is a professional investment, you got to think of that too, of this is an investment, right? How are you going to start to potentially make money on this investment? If you're a cinematographer, I know a lot of cinematographers in narrative work invest in cameras and include that with their personal kind of rental fees, so, or their day rate. So if you're getting hired as a cinematographer, they're hiring you plus your camera in most instances. So that could be a great way to kind of make a little bit of return on investment and figure out how you can really justify the cost of something that big and something that expensive. So working into the business side of it. Another website I should mention when it comes to like rentals and things like that, which kind of ties into what we're talking about now, is called ShareGrid. So ShareGrid is a website that's set up locally in different cities, especially around the US, where owner-operators, people who own cameras, can put them up for rental. So you could rent my camera. You come over to my house and you pick up the camera, you use it, you bring it back. It's all insured through ShareGrid. They have their own kind of insurance built in, so there's a little fee with that. But it's a great way to kind of connect people who need to rent and people who own gear. So that is ShareGrid. So that could be another option if you invest in a camera, you want to try and make a little return on investment, and you're not using it as much maybe as you thought you would, or you have some downtime where the camera is not in use. That could be a great option to try and make a little bit of money, a little bit of payoff on that initial investment of yours. So what I mean between cameras for play versus cameras for work, you'll find if you just search digital video camera online, you're going to find a whole bunch of options. And a majority of those are probably what I would consider camcorders. So a camcorder is a non-professional video camera, right? This is something that you'd probably have to, you film your kids opening presents on Christmas Day. So something like that that's not necessarily a professional tool per se, but has the possibility to just capture a nice looking image, something if you're looking to capture memories. So all of that certainly has its place, just maybe not in the lecture and the stuff we're talking about right now in terms of professional digital cinema cameras. So that's really the delineation, a camcorder versus a digital cinema camera. So these digital cinema cameras, that's what we're using for narrative, documentary, more of your traditional filmmaking. So with these digital cinema cameras, what we have seen, and it's kind of an interesting thing to talk about, is the rise of the multi-purpose camera. So this started roughly about 10 plus years ago with the rise of DSLRs. So DSLRs, you're probably used to seeing those as the big photography cameras like what's pictured here at the bottom left of the slide. That's a Canon 5D. That would be considered a DSLR. What makes it a DSLR is it has an actual mirror inside. So the light enters the lens, hits that mirror, and then is reflected back up into the viewfinder. So you're able to, in a way, see exactly what is coming through that lens. Now, that's helpful, but then when you take the picture, that mirror has to flip out of the way so that the light coming through hits the sensor itself instead of that mirror. So it's an actual mirror that flips up, flips down whenever you're taking a picture. If you're shooting video, that mirror flips up and stays up. So the light is constantly going straight through the lens onto the sensor itself. So with the DSLRs, we started to, about 10 years ago, get the ability to record HD video at around 24 frames per second. So it worked very similar to how a video camera would work. So from there, we've seen a proliferation of these cameras that were originally designed for still photography, having video options. So DSLRs were really kind of the first salvo in this, and now we're in the realm of mirrorless cameras. So that mirror I was talking about that flips up and down, well, that's gone. Now it's just straight through to the sensor itself. You've probably had a mirrorless camera well, actually I would all but guarantee you have a mirrorless camera some way, shape, or form, because even in the early days, the point and shoot cameras, right? The ones that you would keep in your pocket and take with you on family vacations and snap photos of, all the cool stuff you're seeing on your trip. Congratulations, you were using a mirrorless camera. It may have had a video option, maybe not, who knows, but nowadays they pretty much all have pretty good video options, which is exciting because it's a smaller camera, less noise, and you can really get a good looking image out of it. Another aspect of mirrorless cameras, the phone you have. If your phone has a camera on it, which nowadays, I don't know if I've ever seen a cell phone that doesn't have a camera on it now. It seems like, how far we've come. That, again, is a mirrorless option because that is a camera where light is passing through a lens onto the sensor itself, working very much the same way. So with these rise of different camera formats, it's created a lot of interesting options for us as filmmakers about what might actually be the best camera. So let's talk a little bit about the visual element of what you're actually looking to record. So quality images versus image quality. What does that really mean? I just mix around some words? Not really. So quality images. So what is a quality image? That is, for me, and this is incredibly personal, everyone's definition of a quality image might be different. For me, it's an image that tells a story. right? That's the whole goal of a career as a filmmaker, as a cinematographer. You want to create images that tell visual stories. So for me, that is always going to be quality. It has nothing to do with resolution or bit rate or compression or any of this technical side. That is the creative aspect of being a cinematographer, of owning a camera, utilizing that tool to better tell visual stories. So what image quality is, that's the tech side, right? I'd much rather have a quality image than an image that is considered image quality wise, high specs and all that stuff. There are movies that are shot not in 4K. I guarantee it, you've seen movies in the theater that were shot in HD, years ago, potentially in SD, standard definition. There's been movies that have won Sundance that were shot on smartphones. All options are there. Your audience doesn't care what camera you shot on. Your audience cares, are they watching a movie that is engaging, that they can connect with, that is utilizing the image-making aspect to tell impressive and endearing visual stories. That's what we should all ultimately be striving for. The camera is just the tool and a means to an end when it comes to things like that. So with each camera itself, this is where it starts to get into some differences between the manufacturers. Now, every camera has its own distinct look. Now, a lot of you probably grown up with one camera or another, maybe favored Canon or Nikon, or maybe had Sony or Pentax, Olympus, all these different camera brands. And everyone's kind of drawn to one or another for some reason. It's funny. When I talk to people who shoot stills, one of the easy questions, kind of icebreakers is, well, are you a Canon person or a Nikon person? And it tells me so much. Tells me so much about that photographer, and I can start to get into their inner psyche just based on Canon versus Nikon alone. Now, for film, you could say, are you an Arri Alexa person? Are you a Red person? I know for some of you who are cinematographers, you're like, I don't trust Red people. No, it's all good. It's all just a tool. So with all these, they have specific looks to them. So where these looks of the camera come from is from the manufacturers and ultimately the sensor itself. Now, some camera companies like Canon and Arriflex have long histories of creating digital sensors. The quality of this digital sensor is what's making your image look nicer. Better looking skin tones, better looking gradient fall-offs, better looking backgrounds, the way they're mixing resolution to make things look more cinematic. So that is one of the big reasons why, if you look at the cameras that are being used on Hollywood movies today, it's pretty one-sided. A lot of people go in the direction of the Arri Alexa and Arri's cameras. Now, Arri has a long history of making cinema cameras, dating all the way back to the days of film, where they were one of the main forerunners of film cameras as well. So because of that trust in Arri as an institution, and Arri's ability to manage color science and color management, a lot of cinematographers today have continued that trust into selecting their cameras for their movies. And the results are undeniable. Cinematographer, some of you may have heard of, Roger Deakins, kind of a big deal in the cinematography realm. He owns a couple Arri Alexas. So all the movies he shoots are on those, at least in the last 7-8 years, are shot on those Arri Alexa cameras. He's someone who his whole career based in the UK was very much in film cameras, 35 millimeter negative, all of that. And it wasn't until he started shooting on the Arri cameras, then he switched over to digital. Another famous cinematographer, Vilmos Zsigmond, who I worked with at the Global Cinematography Institute, was the same way, would swear by film, it has to be 35, it has to be negative, all this stuff, and his very heavy Hungarian accent. But it wasn't until he started shooting on the Sony f/65 that then he realized, oh, this digital stuff, maybe this is good after all. So we've gotten to the point where the film versus digital debate doesn't really exist anymore because digital has caught up so far. Now, part of that is the look of these particular cameras. So what I'm trying to get at here is that the best camera for you is the one you like the look of. If you like the look of Canon, Canon has some great digital cinema cameras that go right down that line. Arri as well has some great looking cameras. Red has come a long ways. Red as a company has only been around maybe 15, 20 years, something like that. So they're way behind compared to some of these other manufacturers. But in the time where they released the Red 1 all the way up to now, they've come a long ways in terms of image quality. And then Sony as well, one of the other major manufacturers, they've been making cameras forever, really. So Sony also has a long history of visual aesthetics and all that goes into it. So let's transition into breaking down some of these ideas of tech specs. So what goes into the actual technology behind some of these cameras? When you're looking at that spec sheet, you're trying to compare, should I get this camera or that camera, one way or the other? So I have 6 main categories that we're going to dive into a little bit. Sensor size, bit depth, dynamic range, resolution, log and raw, and compression. Now, this might seem a little daunting, especially for some of you. It's maybe a little early on a Saturday morning to be getting into some of this tech stuff, but I'm going to try and sugarcoat it as much as possible. Try to make it as simple to understand as we can. Now, stuff like this in my regular UCLA extension classes are what we spend a lot of time discussing, because I feel like for training a cinematographer, especially a cinematographer who's going to be working a lot in digital, these are crucial concepts to understand as it starts to transition into later on in their career. A lot of this stuff is considered, given knowledge for a lot of cinematographers. So that's what film school for me was really informational for, was learning all this stuff. So that as you then go out into the real world, you're ready to make decisions. You can evaluate camera A versus camera B to pick which one is the best for your particular project. All right, so let's start to dive into it. One of the most important concepts to think about when evaluating different cameras, sensor size. So what is the physical size of the chip? We're talking about the sensor itself. So if you have one of those mirrorless cameras, you can take the lens off and look at it. You're looking right at the digital sensor itself. That sensor, light is falling on it, that's getting converted into ones and zeros, a bunch of digital stuff that goes into the computer inside your camera, and that's how the image is born. So with the sensor itself, the physical size of it makes a big difference. A bigger sensor is more sensitive to light, has less depth of field. You get that shallow depth of field look. So by depth of field, I'm talking about range of focus. So that for me is what kind of separates a cinematic image versus something that's a little less cinematic, is that range of focus. So when you have shallower depth of field or selective depth of field, most importantly, that's what can really help elevate your images. So a bigger sensor is going to help you do that. So a way we can kind of connect this in real world terms is, remember those camcorders I was talking about, the ones you hold up and film your kids running around? Those generally have very small sensors. So those very small sensors allow for everything to be in focus. We're talking about like Citizen Kane levels of deep depth of field. So by having everything in focus, from the perspective of somebody filming their kids running around, the last thing I want to do is miss a shot because it's out of focus, right? So by having everything in focus, that's actually a nice perk for those cameras depending on how you intend to use it. So that's a big reason. I mean, a camcorder is different than a digital cinema camera. Digital cinema, I want that shallow depth of field, that cinematic look. A bigger sensor is going to help me do that. With a smaller sensor as well, that's going to also impact your choice of lenses. Because the smaller the chip is, the smaller that sensor is, the more zoomed in your lenses feel. So like a DSLR, right? If you're putting a lens on the front of a camera, taking a picture, things like that, you have interchangeable lenses. Now, if I was to put one of those on, let's say, a Panasonic GH5, a Lumix camera, those have slightly smaller sensors than, let's say, a Sony a7S that has a large full-frame size sensor. So you'll be able to see in the camera specs what size sensor we're talking about. If it's something smaller, you can Google the sensor and it'll tell you how big or small it is. Bigger sensors, always better. So where we are currently is that there actually, in terms of digital cinema cameras, very few small sensor cameras out there. Everything is more or less a 35 millimeter chip, 35 millimeter sensor. So that's the same size as you would have if you're shooting 35 millimeter film. So you can get very cinematic images off of that 35 millimeter chip. Easy to do. Smaller, Not so much. So this is maybe 10, 15 years ago where it was really hard to get that shallow depth of field look, but nowadays almost every camera, professional camera, is at least 35 millimeter or bigger, which is really cool. Okay, so let's move into the concept of bit depth. So bit depth, and I know you're looking at this graph now, you're like, gosh darn it, it's a Saturday and this guy's making me do math? What the heck? So I'll try to take it easy on you as much as I can. I know people are here to be filmmakers, not mathematicians. I get that all the time. So with bit depth, a way to simplify this concept is as the light is falling onto the chip, onto the sensor itself, it's going into the computer. Every digital camera has a computer, right? These are essentially computers with a lens port. That's what we're looking at here with digital cameras. So all of them have a small computer built in. What bit depth is doing is kind of figuring out how much sampling, how much measurement of the light that's falling on the chip is happening. Now this varies from camera to camera, so the computer is actually registering the light levels falling on the sensor. So how often it measures those light levels is indicative of bit depth. So here's a good way to think about the concept of sampling. So with sampling, as we start to measure information coming off of the sensor itself, so let's say you have the original shape there on the left, and then the second column, the shape is then sampled. On our top one, it's only being sampled 5 times, and it's double that on the bottom one. Now third column, all our camera actually is recording are those blue vertical lines. We have no idea what the original image actually looks like. All we know is what's being sampled at the camera sensor itself. And then you can see in the last column the resulting shape. Now, which of these is more realistic to the original image? The one that did more sampling. So that is a clear indicator that we want a camera that samples more, not less. Now, this is what bit depth is. So you'll see cameras put out there as 8-bit, or 10-bit, 12-bit, 16-bit. Those are kind of the big 4 options. Now, a 10-bit camera is going to sample more than an 8-bit camera. So with bit depth, the more samples, more colors, less color aliasing, higher bits, higher bit depth. So the more bits in the image, the more realistic it's going to become, just like we saw in that last slide. So what this really means in terms of 8-bit, 10-bit, 12-bit, so in 8-bit cameras, you only have 256 shades of red, green, and blue, and most importantly, gray. So this is where exposure is coming from as well. So think of it like a box of crayons, right? You got, maybe it would take everyone back to their childhood. Maybe you only had the 8-pack of crayons, and you could, draw pictures and color and things like that. But at the end of the day, you only had 8 colors to choose from. Well, there might be that other kid in school that had, the really nice set, right? The big, like 250 pack of crayons. You know who I'm talking about. It's all burned into our heads. That guy. So you get the big pack of crayons, and that's what enables you to do more realistic looking images. You have more colors, more options. That is bit depth, right? The more shades of gray, the more reds, green, and blues you have to work with, the more realistic your image is going to become. So here's a little quick example. So this is what the benefit of bit depth really is. So in this graphic, this is an 8-bit, 256 shades of color. So now I'm going to go the reverse way and make it worse. So this is our 8-bit. Let me downgrade now to 6-bit, 64 shades of each color channel. So I'll toggle back and forth. Here is 8-bit compared to 6-bit. And I know this is maybe a little tricky depending on the quality of your streaming connection right now. All the things you see online might look like 6-bit, which in that case, sorry, can't help you out too much. Here's 5, so we'll toggle again, 6 to 5. Ooh, now we're getting gross, 3-bit. Only 8 shades of red, green, and blue, and you have to create all your images from just that amount of crayons in your crayon box. Not good, not good at all. So that is the advantage of bit depth. So here's where all of our different kind of professional digital cinema cameras fall in terms of bit depth. So in 8-bit, These are going to be mostly your DSLRs in video mode. A lot of your lesser expensive cameras are ones that were geared towards still photography, that are being repurposed for video, are going to be in that 8-bit world. Some Canon, some Sony as well. Once you get into 10-bit, this is where a lot of modern cameras are living. Even in the kind of entry level, more cameras are falling into the 10-bit world, which for me, that's kind of my minimum, is I want a camera that shoots at minimum 10-bit. 8-bit, forget about it. Maybe if you just need a couple shots here and there, like a GoPro, right? If you have a couple GoPro shots in your movie, you can ultimately get away with it. But I try to have everything, especially my main camera going into a shoot, to be at least 10-bit. And once we get into 12-bit, 16-bit, now we're into RAW and some of the more higher-end cameras, higher-end recording specs. We'll talk about log and RAW coming up, but once you get into RAW, it's pretty seldom that ones are still 10-bit. Most of the time, if you're shooting in RAW, it's going to be more, which is great. Okay, so let's move on to our next concept here, dynamic range. So with dynamic range, this is the measurement of the latitude of the camera. So if any of you have kind of like a film background, you might be aware of like film latitude and things like that. So what latitude actually is the amount of contrast that you can hold in a camera system. Your difference between the brightest white and the blackest black, and everywhere in between. So we've probably seen a lot of early video stuff, right? Those little flip-out camcorders, shooting mini DV tapes. I know some of you, like, the PTSD just kicked in of tape. I know, you have shoe boxes of mini DV tapes lying around. I guarantee you do. Almost everybody does. Good luck getting those digitized now. So with that era of tape and SD, one of the big visual components of that was this kind of like high contrast. The whites really clipped very quickly. The blacks crushed very quickly. It was a very high contrast image. That was because the camera itself didn't have very good dynamic range. So what we're looking for in dynamic range, how we're measuring that, is in stops. So a stop is a common term in photography and exposure, determining exposure with light. So a stop is either double or half the amount of light that is passing through a lens and falling on the sensor itself. Think of it as the light that's being transmitted from real life to your camera. And by setting a stop, this is most commonly called like an f-stop or a t-stop on the lens itself, or in your camera settings, you can set your exposure at something like, you know, f5.6 or f4 or 2.8. These are all exposure numbers that dictate the opening, the iris of the lens, and how that light is coming through and ultimately falling on the sensor itself. So we want to have the range to capture as many of these stops as possible in our camera. The more stops we have, the more realistic the image is going to become. When you think about it, we all are walking around with essentially imaging devices in our head at all times. So what is the bit rate of our eyesight? What is the sensor size, right? What is the dynamic range? All of these far exceed what any digital camera can do, right? I would hope so. Now, with all of this stuff, what our main goal in the tech is to create images that are most realistic to our actual eyesight. The more bits, the better. The more dynamic range, the better. All of this stuff is factoring into our ultimate goal of creating realistic, lifelike images. And we've come a long ways over a short period of time from the early days of video to where we are now with digital cinema cameras. So with dynamic range, this latitude, we're looking at the number of potential stops of visible dynamic range. How many stops of information can we see? Now, if your image is brightly exposed, if you know how to make a good looking, proper exposed, not too bright, not too dark, dynamic range might not be of all that interest to you, right? If you're able to control your exposure. But think of it from the perspective of a documentary filmmaker, right? You're going on a location, you have a camera on your shoulder, you don't really have any lighting gear, you don't have much equipment to control exposure, it's just what you see by eye. So how can you manipulate the camera, the lens, the settings to try and create that realistic, lifelike image just using your technical knowledge and your skills as a cinematographer? So that's where controlling dynamic range and deciding, do I need to expose for the highlights? Do I need to expose for the shadows? where do I place my exposure in order to capture the most stops of range? In terms of cameras, a high dynamic range camera is what's going to help you the most when it comes to capturing that wide range of image. So like an example here on the slide, the top versus the bottom, the top image is what I would consider low dynamic range. Deeper blacks, those whites back in the background are completely white and blown out. You look at the bottom image and we have detail. Now we can see the clouds, we can see the blue sky, we can see a lot more detail into those shadows. So dynamic range is actually a really important aspect of choosing a camera. And this is something you're going to find when you're looking at the spec sheets on these different cameras. It's going to say, you know, the Sony a7S has 15 or more stops of dynamic range. The Canon C300 is going to have 17 stops of dynamic range. The Arri Alexa might have 29 stops of dynamic range. It doesn't. No camera really does. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at evaluating, comparing camera A to camera B. Keeping that in mind. Now, the thing with dynamic range and those spec sheets, manufacturers, they're not lying. It'd be wrong for me to say they're lying on their spec sheets, but they might be exaggerating the truth a little bit on some of this stuff. So as one of the things I actually do in the Camera Savvy class at UCLA Extension, we bring in cameras and set them up and shoot color charts and test dynamic range so that we can find out what is that real range? What is that number? What is the manufacturer saying it is compared to what it actually is? So that's the visible versus extractable dynamic range. So all of that is things I dive into in my class. And well, it is Saturday morning and you're all probably still working through your first cup of coffee, so we won't do that right now. Okay, so moving on to resolution. Okay, so this is probably the sexiest topic when it comes to choosing cameras. This is the one a lot of people like to talk about. This is one of the things that the producers also tend to obsess over for some reason, probably because it's one of the easier concepts to wrap your head around when it comes to the tech side. So the K wars. How many Ks? 4K, 5K, 6K, 8K. All of these options. So when we're talking about resolution, this is the actual pixel size of your captured image. All the way down from standard def, which is the smallest box here in the window, up to 8K Ultra HD, which is the largest box. So you can see how all those different formats compare. If you're shooting just HD, what are the advantages of jumping up to 4K or 8K or beyond? All of those options are available to you. Now, with resolution, it's great that our cameras can capture excessive numbers of Ks, and that's something we've seen for sure over the last 3-4 years, is that the K counts are rising. It used to be a big deal if you had a 4K camera. Now, 8K is a very real thing. Blackmagic has a camera out there that shoots 6K for under $2,000. It's incredible. It's incredible to think that that's where we are now, considering where resolution was, where a 4K camera, well, that was going to set you back at least 10 grand. This is only about 4 or 5 years ago. So resolution has become much more accessible in smaller modeled cameras. Now, the big thing to keep in mind with all of this is display resolution. So how are we actually seeing these images? What are the advantages of capturing 4K, 6K, 8K, and beyond? Now, our TVs at home, our displays, computer displays, things like that, that's how we're viewing these images. So maybe you have an 8K TV. They're starting to come out. People are starting to make them. Now, do you have any content that's 8K? No, no way. No way. We're in post-production, especially the work I'm doing now, it's still about 50-50 whether we finish a project in 4K or HD. We're not even talking 8K at this point. 4K is pretty much still the limit. Now 4K TVs, the price is going down, and I'd say it's maybe about a 2/3 market saturation at this point. Two out of 3 people have something that's capable of showing the image in true 4K, and the 4K content is increasing, which is also great. Netflix can stream 4K, Amazon streaming 4K, Disney Plus is streaming 4K as well. So the content, the streaming sites are pushing you 4K content. So that's always something to keep in mind. Now, on the camera side, well, based on that logic, right, I should be fine just having 4K, right? Why would I have a 6K camera or an 8K camera or any of this stuff? Now, with that, the real advantage is where you're going to get to in post-production. So on set and in post, having that slightly larger image, knowing your final is only going to be 4K, but going out to 6K gives you the advantage of potentially doing more stabilization stuff in post. Because when you think about it, when you have a 4K image and you're delivering 4K, as soon as you scale that up even 1%, you're losing quality. You're losing visual quality. Your images aren't going to look as good. You just did a 1K scale up. Not great. But if you shoot 6K and you're delivering 4K, well, yeah, you could scale that up 20, 25% and not lose any quality. So the ability to reframe, to do stabilizations, to do little digital zoom moves or things like that, all of those are great advantages of shooting higher resolutions, knowing that ultimately you're going to be delivering 4K, or if you're delivering HD, even better, right? So many more possibilities when you're just trying to deliver an HD final video. So resolution, yeah, it matters. It opens up more creative possibilities, but is it ultimately that important to the quality of the image? Not really, right? For me, I think dynamic range is much more important to looking at an image than resolution. The number of stops I can see, that for me is much more realistic than resolution. Because resolution, you're dependent upon your display, right? And if you're looking at stuff on your phone, I bet that 8K image looks beautiful on an iPhone. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about resolution. Okay, next concept, log versus raw. Now, with log and raw, these are very dense technical concepts that we won't get too deep down that rabbit hole, but it's important that we bring it up now. So with log versus raw, a baked-in capture versus a raw capture. So with raw, it's easier to talk about raw first. That is essentially bypassing that computer in the camera that I was talking about, where we're coming off the sensor, it's hitting the computer, the sensor, that's going into the analog digital converter, bit rate, all that stuff's getting applied. So within that computer, well, the computer itself is pretty much garbage, right? Think about how small the camera is. So we're putting a lens on it, a sensor, all this stuff, and fitting a computer in it? Now, you're used to like your laptop or something like that amount of processing power, to shrink it down to the point where we can put it in a camera body, that is some pretty significant engineering, which hasn't really happened yet. So the computer inside your camera is a load of hot garbage. Welcome to real life. So what the camera manufacturers thought of, and particularly Red, we got to give Red their due when it comes to camera raw, because they were the first ones to think about this and be like, you know, why should we make super expensive cameras with super expensive computers inside when the people buying our cameras have laptops, they have desktops, they have personal PCs that are able to do processing at such a high level compared to the cost it would put on us to put that inside a camera. So let's instead record raw. So this raw bypasses that and gives you all that data on the memory card that then you put into your computer at home, and your home computer finishes that processing. Really smart concept. And because of that, Red was able to introduce 4K RAW way before. We're talking 5, 6 years before it became a very common concept. So Red was first by far, and the cost of their cameras was low enough that a lot of people just straight up bought them. So the people who owned Red cameras were early adopters of this new RAW technology that has now completely taken over Hollywood and camera manufacturing. We're getting to the point very, very soon where your smartphone is going to be able to record RAW video. And we have Red to ultimately thank for that. So that's been the acceleration of all that. In the stills world, RAW has existed for a while because they had the same concept. In a DSLR, let's not put a good computer in it. Let's give people the option in post-production to be able to manipulate and control that image much more readily. So RAW has a huge advantage when it comes to post-production processing. Now, log, on the other hand, log has to do with this image curve that's being applied to the captured image. So that's what I consider bake-in versus raw. Log can be baked in. So in this case, it's not raw, but it has log. So log stands for a logarithmic curve, which again, see, here I am, Saturday trying to teach you math. Not going to happen. So an easy way to think about log, contrast, right? By lowering the contrast of the captured image, we're able to elevate the black point. By lifting up that black point, we can see more into the shadows. By rolling off the highlights, we're able to see more into the brightest parts of our image. More dynamic range. So by introducing a log curve to our image, we're getting more stops, more dynamic range, higher quality images, A+ all around. So log has a huge advantage. Now, when you shoot raw, more than likely, log is already included in that process. So if you have a camera that can record video in RAW, log is probably one of those things you don't have to worry about as much. But if you don't have RAW, definitely make sure you have log, because that's really going to increase the technical capabilities of your particular camera system. So what constitutes log? So you might see this on a spec sheet like, it uses Canon log or Sony log or Blackmagic film or something like that. These are all names of log curves and how you're able to get more stops utilizing those log curves. Now it's completely optional. You can turn those off and then you have a normal, a proper looking image. Turning on a log curve will make your image very low contrast, and therefore it's going to require a little bit of processing in post-production to restore that contrast. So that's where this concept of lookup tables comes into play. Some of you may have heard of a LUT before, or lookup tables. We won't get too deep into that now, but if you are interested in doing the deep dive on LUTs with me, I have a class coming up in spring quarter, role of the DIT in cinematography. I feel like the subtitle for that class should be LUTs and stuff, because we talk a lot about LUTs and stuff. So that would be a great opportunity for you coming up to, if you really want to do a deep dive and talk a lot more about lookup tables, what they are, how you create them, what they do, how you manage them on set, all those different aspects is stuff that we can go deep on for sure. So log and raw, very important in the equation. Last concept we'll talk about here, compression. So compression, now we've gone through the entire process, light coming through, falling on the sensor, going into that computer. Now what's happening on the back end? That's compression, the necessary evil. So what compression is doing is throwing away non-essential, what they deem non-essential data, and how that's being limited in human vision, discarding what they feel like is not necessary, reducing that data rate, the actual amount of information being recorded, and then put onto the little memory card that's in the back of your camera. So every camera more or less shoots with some form of compression. Nicer digital cinema cameras allow you to change the amount of compression that you're recording to. Even some like DSLRs and mirrorless cameras have different compression recording options. Now, all of this, what compression is best for you, really depends on your shooting situation. Are you looking to shoot a documentary and you want to have really long record times? Well, then shoot more compressed. If you're looking for shooting a narrative, single camera movie, and you know there's going to be visual effects, green screen, explosions, CGI monsters, all this fun stuff that we can expect to see on our screens these days, then I'm going to need as little compression as possible. For images that are going to be used a lot in post-production, less compression is by far and away preferable. So it's important really for the cinematographer going into a project to understand the bigger picture of what this project, where it's going, what the different aspects are in choosing a compression. So when it comes down to compression itself, some cameras have the option of bypassing the internal compression. So the internal compression, if you're stuck with it, most cameras have actually really bad internal compression because they're taking these big images and they're crunching it down into small files that fit on like an SD card. That requires a lot of compression just to make that possible. When you think about RAW, right, we have huge amounts of data, an immense data stream. So that's going to require shrinking down the image as well, compressing that RAW to get it into something that can actually be recorded. So internal recording, usually not very good. some cameras actually have options to upgrade your compression by going to external compression. So with an external recorder, this would be a separate box attached to your camera that's connected through a video cable that allows you to record your image away from the computer, away from the camera itself, and record at different compressions, potentially different bit depths, different resolutions, maybe introducing RAW, potential for RAW recording through an external box. All these options are possible. So for external compression, external recorders, some companies, really the big one right now is Atomos. They make the Atomos like Ninja, Sumo. They have great names for all this stuff. If you're looking for great product names, inspiration, just look at what Red names their cameras and look at what Atmos names their recorders. It's just chef's kiss, just totally out there. So Atmos recorders are great for external compression, external recording. There's several other companies. Blackmagic makes one as well. So there are a bunch of different options out there, and it all depends on your camera system, whether there is an advantage of pairing it with an external recorder or not, or just going internal. There's really no reason why, let's say if you're shooting on an Arri Alexa or a Red camera, you would ever need to use an external recorder. So it all depends. Okay, so let's talk about the two different types of compression. So within compression, there's interframe versus intraframe. I know, it's like you couldn't have picked two names that are more alike, really? So interframe, emphasis on the ER, compares one frame with successive or previous frames to determine differences and motion prediction. Okay, so what that means, look at my beautiful red bouncing ball here in the slide. That is a red ball on the ground, right? Beautiful artwork. As that red ball bounces up and down, the camera is only recording the differences in motion. So as that red ball moves up, you can see in the second little frame of film, the only thing that's being recorded is the ball going up, and then the ground underneath is being replaced with white. So as we move through those different film strips, you'll see that's the only stuff that's being recorded. Everything else is exactly the same, like the white background. From the camera's perspective, it's like, well, why should I record that? We can just copy paste. So they'll just copy paste the background across a span of frames because they determine, nothing's really happening. Well, when they copy paste it like that, that helps get you small data rates. That helps shrink down the file. That is compression. Okay, so what happens if all of a sudden you're panning the camera or tilting, or you're a handheld shot or a dolly, or there's a lot of movement? Well, in that case, the camera's going to have a hard time because the background's changing constantly. So then you might start to get more of what we call compression artifacts. So blocky looking things, it looks like your image is kind of breaking apart digitally. That's because of bad compression. So what falls in this bad compression category? Oh, our old friend, you know him, you love him. If you've worked with videos on a computer, you probably know it all too well, H.264. Your H.264 is this bad compression. But hey, the advantage is it's super easy to play back. You can upload a video to YouTube and it processes and plays back really easily. You can put a video on someone's phone or iPad, it plays back super easily. H.264 is super versatile, but the compression is complete and total garbage. Something for me as a colorist I have to deal with all the time, that the work we're doing in the color suite, putting the final touches on a cinematic feature film, especially now within the last year and the rise of virtual film festivals, all that hard work we're putting into the image is ultimately getting packaged in an H.264 and streamed online to somebody's smartphone as they're sitting on the toilet. You know, this is Hollywood in 2020 and 2021, so hooray. So other compressions like that, XAVC, things like that. If you're unsure if what category your compression falls under, you can always Google it and it will tell if it's an interframe or intraframe. So let's talk about the other category, intraframe compression, RA, not ER. So intraframe compression, this will be your ProRes, DNX, and RAW. So what intraframe is doing is treating it like film, where each frame is its own self-contained image. So like a film camera, you have film running through and it's essentially capturing every 24th of a second a new image on the film strip. Same thing, same idea that's happening in digital, just without the film strip. So every frame is its own self-contained picture. There's no copy-paste going on. So it's a much preferable way of compressing and recording images. So with this whole intra-frame compression and the lossless form, so the way we're able to actually add compression is through an algorithm. So it's very high-end tech, a lot of computer processing going into this, where you can control your compression ratio and be able to get more record time or higher quality images, but still keep it in this intra-frame where each frame is its own self-contained image. So the advantages of intra-frame versus intra-frame is really when it comes down to recording. So when you're recording, when you're selecting a camera, and it'll tell you what the internal compression is. If it's H.264 or XAVC or something that falls in that bad column, be very concerned. Because that artifacting I was telling you about that could happen with high motion or things like that, when it's happening in camera, that means you're recording that image. And if you're recording that image, there's no going back. If all that junk is baked into it, you're literally up a creek without a paddle. There's no way to go back. So that is really concerning for me as a cinematographer. I'd have to be very, very mindful of what I'm recording and, oh, does that work with the compression and all this stuff, which is the last thing you want to be worrying about when you're on set. But this good column, the intra-frame stuff, this is the things I want to record. So I want to be able to record into ProRes or DNX, which is the Avid codec, or RAW, or DPX, or there's a bunch of other intra-frame codecs as well. And these are most ideal for capture. The Arri Alexa shoots to ProRes and RAW. The Red shoots to RAW. High-end Sony cameras shoot to RAW. So all the big heavy hitters out there record into this setting. The only cameras you're really going to find that are in the bad column, those are going to be some of your like DSLRs, mirrorless cameras, the ones that aren't really designed for video, that are utilizing different compressions to try and put stuff down to the little SD cards. So those are the ones you just have to be a little bit more hesitant with. Now, a good way to get around this, like we mentioned before, pairing it with an external recorder. So that external recorder will allow you to bypass that crummy internal compression and record to something like ProRes or RAW or DNX. So that is a great way if you have a camera like, let's say, a Sony a7S, little mirrorless camera, big sensor, the internal recording, garbage. But you can connect it over HDMI back into an external recorder and then immediately get ProRes out of it. So you're upping the value of your camera just by pairing it with an external recorder. So pretty cool. Okay, so that's our big kind of set of tech specs. We talked about sensor size, bit depth, resolution, dynamic range, log and raw, compression. Holy, you've gotten like a little, the 45-minute rundown of all the crucial concepts of digital cinematography, and hopefully how all of these fit into our different digital cameras. So what's the best camera for me? Easy answer. So just like at the very beginning of the class, they were talking about how students ask all the time, like, what camera should I get? This, that. For me, it's an easy answer. It's the best camera you can afford. So obviously a little more goes into it than that, as you just saw talking about the creative and technical aspects of choosing a camera. So now let's start to talk about what cameras are actually available. So first and foremost, let's talk about the little, the elephant in the room. Well, or the elephant in your pocket, in a way. Pocket cinematography. So this is, if you'd asked me this a couple years ago, like, oh yeah, I just, I got an iPhone. Can I use that for my class or for my project or whatever? I would have kind of given you kind of an odd look. But now that's a legitimate solution for shooting a lot of video, a lot of movies. There was a movie that won at Sundance several years ago called Tangerine. That was actually shot kind of right around the corner of the studio I'm filming in right now. And that movie was shot entirely on an iPhone. And it won Sundance. So if that's not an indicator of the quality versus image quality debate, I don't know what is. So with pocket cinematography, smartphones, this is almost like starting to exceed some digital cinema cameras. So when we talk about resolution, lens choice used to be a big issue as related to smartphone cinematography because you were limited to just that one kind of cheapest possible camera that they plugged in the back of your phone. But nowadays, with iPhones with 3 lens systems, Google, Android, all these other options that are adding more and more cameras, different lens options, that's huge. It used to be on smartphones when you zoomed in, you were actually doing a digital zoom, and that's when you immediately lose quality, like we were talking about with resolution. Not great. But now when you have multiple lens options in the back of your smartphone, you're able to toggle through different optical options. And these are not digital zooms. These are actual lenses. So that's really exciting. So other things like compression, slow-mo recording, manual exposure, manual white balance, all that stuff, the innovations have really kind of come along for smartphone videography. Now, what separates just just flipping open your camera app, switching over to video mode, and then just hitting the red button, right? Does that make me a cinematographer? Well, it's about intention of choice. So what I really separates someone from just like a point and shoot, hit the red button and hope for the best, and a cinematographer is making creative decisions, making technical decisions to help better tell a visual story. If your tool doesn't allow you to make those decisions, well, then you're extremely limited artistically about how you can utilize that tool to tell a visual story. So what I kind of get around a lot of that and through apps. So there's one particular app called Filmic Pro. That's actually the app they use to film the movie Tangerine on. And an app like that kind of allows for a lot more manual control over what your smartphone's camera can actually do. So now I want to do a brief little demo, and granted, this is like the first time I'm putting my phone up on Zoom, so let's see how this goes. But with this Filmic Pro app, I'm going to go ahead and connect my, I'm running like an iPhone 11, so I'll connect that up, and we'll be able to do a quick little demo here of the Filmic Pro app. So let me get that patched in. There we go. Hey, there we are. So now you get a There we are. Okay, so this is the Filmic Pro app, and now I have my lovely talent stand-ins here. All I have to do is, credit copy meals, just the standard compensation here for my on-camera talent. So what we're looking at here is Filmic Pro. So this is an app for iOS and Android, about a $15 app, which is, a little expensive as far as apps go, but it has a lot of cool functionality built in. So as you can see kind of right away on the right, it's giving me VU meters, so I can actually monitor my audio, and I can designate which microphone on the phone I want to use for this particular application. I have my record button right down there in the bottom right, and I know you can't actually see where I'm tapping, so I'm going to try and be as descriptive as possible. Now, in the middle of the interface, you have a circle and a square. The circle is what's controlling exposure. So if I was to tilt up to my lights right now and tap that, you can see the image getting darker because I'm exposing for that fluorescent light up there. Now, if I want to keep that exposure, I can then tap that circle, goes red, pan back down to my talent, and now I have a manual exposure control. I'm able to dictate the brightness. If I want to release that, I just tap that circle again, and then the exposure goes right back. Then the other one is focus. So for that, we're going to have our lovely cat stand in here. So the white square dictates where I want to focus. So if I take that over to the, let me back up a little bit here. Yep, you can see now we're kind of pulling focus a little bit back towards the other model. So I can tap that box to lock focus as well. So with focus and exposure, if I swipe here on the left, now that's opened up a dial where I can manually go up and down to control my exposure. Now, a thing with smartphone cameras, they don't have mechanical irises in them. So this is very different than we're used to on a traditional lens, where it will have a real iris, a real f-stop on it. So the way smartphone cameras work is the iris is always wide open. Right? The fewer mechanical things they can put in a phone, the better, because the mechanical stuff is what breaks. Not ideal. So the way the smartphone's controlling it is through brightness. Controlling it through shutter and ISO, or camera sensitivity. So as I go up and down, those numbers on the left So like 44, I can lock my ISO at 44. I can lock my shutter at 1/48. So shutter and ISO are two common aspects of photography. So I have manual control over those, and that's how I'm ultimately dictating exposure. Pretty cool. So if I swipe here on the left, now I can also do manual focus. So here we go. Let's set up our cinematic focus pull. Well, you can't say, at least you're not amused in this UCLA Extension seminar. You never thought you were signing up for a camera class to see me rack focus from a plastic cat to a ship's wheel. But here we are. Pretty cool innovation though for smartphone cinematography, because focus is again one of the creative aspects of visual storytelling. Same thing here on zoom. I can do manual zoom, zoom in, zoom out, and dictate all of that directly here in the app. So other aspects of manual control, we'll get rid of that. Let's pull focus there. Color temperature. So I just tap the little 3 color wheels down here, and I can set a manual white balance. So I can white balance my camera to the different presets. So right now I'm under daylight conditions, so I can choose a little sun icon. I have a slider where I can go up and down to change my white balance and tint as well, or just do an auto white balance, and it'll dial that in. And then next option, this is something that's part of their cinematographer app, cinematographer add-on within this Filmic Pro app. So as part of their add-on, you can choose a log curve. You have natural, dynamic, flat, and log. So this is a good example of what we were talking about earlier, toggling between natural, which would be a proper looking image, and log, lower contrast, more dynamic range. Natural versus log, pretty cool. And then you can also do a little bit of color correction as well. So here in the RGB little histogram sliders, I can do a little bit of color adjustments as well, change the look and mood of my image that way as well. Pretty cool. Now there's also some exposure tools built in. If I tap on the, so this little circle with the lines around it, that just enabled those manual controls we saw earlier. I tap on that little A icon. I have stuff like zebras for exposure, false color. There's the false color, focus peaking. So these are common tools you would find in a professional digital cinema camera. It's pretty amazing that we're seeing it here in an app. So also if I tap on where that time code clock is running, I can see a histogram, I can see a waveform monitor, all of some of the tools that cinematographers are accustomed to using. Now if I go to settings here, this is where I can control my resolution. So we can go 4K, 3K, I can set what type of resolution I want to record in. I can also set my compression. So I can go economy, Apple standard, or higher quality as well. So this will be extremely helpful if I'm needing to use images like this for actual cinematic production. So I can control that, I can do frame rate, I can do slow motion there in frame rate, audio, can set different audio compression as well. You could connect this to a Bluetooth microphone so you can have external audio, a little higher quality as well. Pretty cool as well. That has built-in image stabilization you can work with, and a lot of other fun little settings, a guide for framing, things like that. So this app is Filmic Pro, $15 application, gives you all those type of manual controls for working with video on a smartphone. So I'd like to thank my talent, the cat and the wheel. Thank you for coming to play. We'll give them a big hand here in the end. All right, or I'll have to call their agent. All right, here we are, back. Well, that was a little, a little something different at least. So talking about pocket cinematography, you know those options. Okay, so now moving on to the next level of cameras. So stills camera with video. So these are some of the cameras we've been talking about before with DSLRs, moving into mirrorless as well. So with those DSLRs, one of the big limitations was obviously resolution. A lot of them were only going to be HD, 35, the sensors were nice and big. So about 10 years ago, the idea of digital video was usually those really small chip cameras, not ideal. But with DSLRs, now we have much bigger sensors. Sensor size, really important. So with those larger sensors, around 24 to 30 frames per second, These were the Canon 5D and 7D, were the two big players back then. So that was a big indicator, and those were really popular cameras back then. So the 5D and the 7D. And nowadays, Canon still makes those cameras. They've elevated them. I think we're on Canon 5D Mark IV at this point. We're at a higher mark for the 7D as well. And now they can record higher than, around 4K or beyond. So once those Canon DSLRs became extremely popular, everyone else kind of dived in and started highlighting the video capabilities of their stills cameras. Nikon had an option, Sony had an option with their Alpha line, Fuji, even Leica had video options with some of their mirrorless and DSLR cameras as well. So that was a really big kind of swelling of things in the camera industry. And I'd say if you went to NAB or Cinegear, any of these big cinematography filmmaking trade shows, it was about 5, 6, 7 years ago, everything was DSLR and mirrorless. It was really amazing how all these different manufacturers were doubling down because of this big reason: the cameras were affordable. Before, it had been only the big guys, right? The Aries, the Panavisions, all these other big manufacturers who were making these cameras that no one could really afford. People could rent or go through rental houses to get, but the idea of a DSLR was much more palatable for a lot of users because it's probably something they already had or something that they could easily afford or easily invest in, and not to mention, it shoots really awesome stills. So if you love photography, you love capturing images, this was a great option because you could have a great stills camera and a great video camera all in one. But the video side did have its limitations. The resolution wasn't great, and these cameras weren't really designed for shooting video. That was one of the big problems as well. Overheating was a big thing because with these DSLRs, they're used to, when you think about it, only taking, a photo here, a photo there, all that time. The mirror was down for the most part. But when you're shooting video, that mirror we were talking about earlier, flipped up, light on the sensor, it is actively recording over long periods of time. So because of that, there would usually be a record timeout. So after like 4.5 or 5 minutes, it would just stop recording video, which is, great. Other things that could happen is it would just start to overheat and the camera would just start shutting down, which is also great. I've been on shoots where we were shooting on a Canon 5D or a 7D, and we had to have like a little ice chest with us at all times. So if the camera started to overheat, we just stick it in the ice chest, and then as soon as we're ready to shoot, pull it out. All right, guys, the camera's cold. Let's go. Fortunately, those days are past us, hopefully. So with those DSLR videos, they weren't ideal by any stretch of the imagination. The audio, also, complete garbage. And there was no way to get audio into the camera either. It also didn't have time code, which time code's one of those, it's important to have time code in your camera. That's the running clock of when you hit record, it kind of keeps a timer of that video. Now, all of them have you hit record and it starts at 0, 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. But having running time code where it will tell you at what time. So like at 11 hours and 33 seconds, we hit record. At 36 seconds, we stopped recording. That's important because we can use that time code to later sync with audio. So syncing DSLRs and mirrorless video, not ideal, and that adds a lot of time onto post-production. So those were some of the major disadvantages, but nowadays we're in the dawn of the mirrorless cameras. We've now gotten rid of the mirrors for the most part, and it's just light falling directly on the sensor. These cameras still overheat to a certain extent. They still will time out recording, so those issues haven't necessarily gone away. They've been lessened, certainly, but they're still around as well. But all of the video options have really been amped up with these mirrorless cameras. The potential of pairing them with external recorders that we talked about earlier, especially like with the Sony a7S, you get better bit depth, you get better compression as well. So all of those advantages working with external recorders really makes a difference. Now, with the actual video capabilities right now, one manufacturer has kind of stood out so far, and that's Sony. I'd say for all my students, probably the most common camera I see them investing in is the Sony a7S. So the Sony a7S is a mirrorless camera. The pretty small form factor, about that, almost the size of your cell phone. And that will record 4K video internal with log, no RAW, but with log in 8-bit, less than ideal, but you're able to get very cinematic looking images. Also, sensor size, that Sony a7S has a larger than 35mm size sensor, which is really exciting. More cinematic, shallower depth of field, better light sensitivity, all those great things that go hand in hand with that. So that's been a very popular option, I know, for a lot of people, and Sony has many other models as well that all kind of build upon that foundation that they laid with the Sony a7S. So let's take a look here at some of the options as it relates to mirrorless DSLRs, kind of our entry level of stills cameras with video. So some of these are brand new, that just came out or have just been announced, particularly the Sony Alpha A1, that first one there. Look at that, 8K video internal. Pretty great. Now, on these graphics where I'm talking about the cameras themselves, keep in mind that I'm just putting the Ks on there, even though we just had the whole lecture before this where I was making fun of how Ks are not that important. But I'm putting the Ks on here just because it's a quick, easy way to compare these different cameras directly on a slide like this. So that Sony Alpha 1, Sony just came out with this camera as their new flagship stills camera, which is a big revelation because they're completely moving away from that mirror flipped DSLR. Their flagship camera is now a mirrorless camera. That shows you how much energy Sony is putting into their mirrorless camera line. So that Alpha 1 8K video internal with a lot of compression, but you can get 4.3K RAW external. Pretty awesome. And then you're looking at $6,500 just for the body only. So cost-wise, that definitely puts it at the higher end of these mirrorless cameras, but for the resolution and a lot of the video features, it's pretty high up there. Canon's option is the Canon 5R, or excuse me, R5, that can do 8K RAW with an external recorder, 4K internal, $3,900 for the body. Then here's the Sony a7S. This is the one I was just talking about that's probably one of the most popular options out there. You can get RAW externally. Now, this is a new feature because Sony has had several versions of the a7S. So the a7S Mark III adds that RAW option, which is really exciting. 4K internal, looking at $3,500 of an initial investment just for the body. Now, with all these, I put the price just for the body, but keep in the back of your mind, this is without any lenses. This is without any batteries. This is without any memory cards, monitors, external recorders, tripods, crew, potentially, right? If you need crew, right? People need crew. So all that type of stuff you need to factor into, is this really going to be the right investment for me? Now, with a lot of these cameras, the lens mount might vary. Canon has their proprietary lens mount, which works great with Canon lenses. Sony has their mount, which works with Sony lenses, and so on. Some of the other manufacturers we'll talk about, like Blackmagic and Red, they can have various lens mounts, which is pretty cool. But if you're looking at any of these particular options, keep in mind, if you already own lenses, what type of mount are they, and are they compatible with this camera? Now, there are ways around that, because you can use the camera lens adapters that convert one mount to the next. Most of the time, they should have some type of mount that works for you, but be sure you research that beforehand. Because like I'm a Nikon person for stills, right? We went back to the whole Canon versus Nikon. I'm a Nikon guy. Sorry, guilty as charged. So I own a bunch of Nikon lenses. So I'm able to put Nikon lenses on a Red, on a Sony a7S, on even a Canon 5D through lens adapters. So that's a good option if you already own glass. So the a7S, looking at Panasonic GH5, the Lumix line. Now this is again one that I see a lot of students investing in. A lot of people really love the look of the Panasonic cameras. I love their video cameras. I haven't used the Lumix line much, but what really set it apart is it was one of the first mirrorless cameras to integrate log. So the high dynamic range. This was the highest dynamic range option available in this type of camera for a very long time. Now the drawback is the smaller sensor. I have it listed here as the M4/3. That stands for micro 4/3. So instead of a 35mm chip, this one's going to be slightly smaller, which means all your lenses are going to be slightly more telephoto. Something to keep in mind, a little less cinematic. So, but cost-wise, $1,300 for the body. Not too shabby. And you get the 4K video internal. Fuji has an option as well. Fuji hasn't really been a major player in the cinematic video market, but they have an option here in a mirrorless 4K video internal, $6,000 for the body. Seems like the cost to specs isn't quite adding up, but if you're a Fuji person, you love the look of Fuji, then maybe that is the best camera for you. All depends. And then at the bottom, I have two of the kind of older formats, or well, not older, but formats you're probably a little familiar with, like the Canon 5D Mark IV. This is the latest version of the Canon 5D. We're looking at 4K internal, $2,600 for that body, which is not a bad way, and you can pair it with an external recorder to get that ProRes. You can't get ProRes inside. You have to use external for that. And then the last option, the Canon Rebel T7. So this is kind of the more eco-friendly DSLR line. So you're looking at $550 for the body, and it comes with two lenses. I researched all this a couple days ago on B&H, so there might be some good deals out there. But again, that's limited to HD only. So something to keep in mind for that. All right, so let's move on to out of the stills camera that happened to shoot video into actual video cameras. So the big difference between a stills camera and a video camera is its ergonomics, audio, exposure tools, all that type of stuff we saw in the Filmic Pro app. These cameras more or less have them built in, except for the ones I'm picturing here. Please don't buy those cameras. But I put those cameras up there as a way to kind of symbolize where we've come from, right? The old days of VHS and tape and all these terrible, terrible things. I'm so glad we're past the days of videotape and are into a completely digital file-based recording. It's just so much easier. It's less things you have to purchase, less things you need to go around with. So moving to fully digital is great. We've already talked a little bit about the lifespan of these digital cameras, because something to keep in mind, they get upgraded rapidly. So an important concept we haven't actually touched on so far is, since all of these cameras are essentially computers with lens ports, computers get updates all the time, right? I know if you're like a Windows PC user, you've always had that like Windows software update pop up at the least opportune time. I'm glad our cameras don't do that, but who knows, they might in the future. So one of the things we really need to keep in mind with is all these cameras have what's called firmware. So firmware is essentially the operating system in a way, kind of like your Windows 10 of the computer system or your Mac OS Mojave of the computer system. So that firmware can get updated over time. And when that firmware gets updated, then it can become an entirely different kind of camera. It's changing a lot of the way the camera works. It can add features, it can change features, all of that to keep in mind. So when you buy one of these cameras, and this is something I've seen happen in the last couple of years, which is kind of, I would say, almost a troubling phenomenon, where cameras are getting released with the intention of future firmware updates. So you can buy a camera, and one of the cameras that's out right now is some of Canon's newer, the C300, C500 line. So they have right now, the cameras are out, people own them, and it shoots to a very compressed RAW codec. They've said in the future what's coming is a less compressed RAW codec. But people are still buying the cameras. They're shooting on the cameras. They're using the cameras. So we're buying cameras with the intention of, oh, well, it's only going to get better over time. Trust us. My trust is kind of varies with things like that. So keep in mind firmware, future updates, things like that. It's much more apparent in these video cameras, the digital cinema cameras, than you probably have in the DSLR and mirrorless line. But one firmware update can completely change the game. You can take a cheaper camera and all of a sudden elevate it because they've turned on some new features. So it's a really kind of tricky thing to manage when it comes to picking these digital cameras. Okay, so I have now these digital cinema cameras broken down into 3 different levels: our entry level, mid-level, and high-end for digital cinema cameras. So let's look at some of the entry level options that are available here. Now, one that was just announced fairly recently is the Sony FX3. So the Sony FX3 looks a lot like one of their mirrorless cameras, a Sony a7S or something of that nature, but it's designed as really more of a camera that's video first, stills second. So that's a really interesting option. 4K internal, 4K external, 3900 for the body on that one. And then Blackmagic. So we haven't talked too much about Blackmagic. I know there's been a lot of chat in the, a lot of talking in the chat area about Blackmagic cameras, and I own a Blackmagic camera, right? I'm very much in that camp. I own the Blackmagic Pocket 6K camera. Now, I'll get into the end of how I ultimately went behind my decision in that, but to look at some of the models that are available, Blackmagic's been making cameras for about the last 10 years or so. Much like Red, when Red was first started out, their early cameras had a lot of issues, right? The skin tone, color space wasn't great. A lot of the specs were a bit suspect. Blackmagic as a company had been making hardware switches and DIT-based software for a long time, and then started to get more into the actual cinematography filmmaking world. They acquired the software program DaVinci Resolve, which you probably are familiar with in some aspect. And so they've made all these plays to build out software, to build out hardware, and move into cameras. So where we are now, two of their pocket cameras, as they were, and these are about the size, a little bit bigger than maybe a DSLR, but in a similar form factor. The Blackmagic Pocket 6K, Pocket 4K, you can see the price there, $2,500 for 6K RAW, $1,300 for 4K RAW. This is an incredible deal considering the other cameras we've been discussing. Now, when all this, it just triggers something inside of me that's always skeptical of, oh, really? 6K RAW for $2,500? What's the catch? There should always be a catch. Well, the catch here is it's still 6K. It is full RAW. You are getting the high bit depth, you're getting the resolution, you're getting the better compression. It's checking off all those boxes. It's a Super 35 size sensor. All of that is working. The thing that is kind of the drawback a little bit is the color science on the sensor. It's maybe not as pretty of a camera as like a Canon or an Arri or a Red or Sony at this point. They're still kind of getting their feet wet about making digital sensors. Now, for some people, that might not be a big issue. If you're just looking to get a high resolution raw capture, that's the best bang for your buck by far. End of story. Now, where you can actually elevate these cameras, and this is what went into my decision making behind these cameras, is yeah, it's hitting all these check marks, but artistically, I can take the skills I have in color correction and post-production and apply it to this camera to get really amazing cinematic images out of it. Put a little Canon to Nikon adapter because the lens mount is naturally Canon on a lot of these, and I'm able to put my Nikon lenses on the Blackmagic camera, and then I'm ready to go. It can record to compact flash cards or external hard drive, external SSD drives, which are fairly cheap, all things considered. So really it was the best option for me for the type of shooting, the type of production I was getting ready to do. And it's a very versatile camera, small, can fit in a backpack for documentary, things like that. So it was, for me, a pretty good option, and might be for you too, or might not be, it all depends. So with Blackmagic, they have the Pocket 4K. Also, one I should mention is this Studio, the micro camera. It's so cute. It's so small. It's the Blackmagic micro camera. It's maybe about the size of a milk carton. It's just the darndest, cutest little thing you could ever imagine. The actual lecture you're looking at right now is shot on Blackmagic micro cameras. So I have them at the studio. That's great for live and things like that. Internal recording, not so much. We're looking at HD RAW, but hey, for RAW, under $1,000 for the body, that's not a bad deal, all things considered. Now, something you have to keep in mind is to keep the cost low, it actually doesn't have a screen. So you have to connect it to an external monitor to actually see what you're shooting. Just small, minor details. So Blackmagic Micro is an option for Panasonic. Panasonic's option in this tier is the EVA1, 5.7K video internal. The compression's pretty good, looking at 6,500 on the body for that. Panasonic has a long history of making prosumer level cameras, and the EVA1 is kind of their entry level into digital cinema. And then on Canon, Canon has a couple models down here that might be of interest. The Canon C200, which is a 4K RAW internal recording, RAW Lite, with the bigger RAW coming potentially later via firmware update. $5,500 for the body on that. And then the Canon C100 Mark II, you're looking at HD internal video. This is their entry level into their C whatever line, Canon's EOS Cinema cameras. So you're looking at 2700 just for the body on that, but it's native Canon lens mount. So if you have Canon lenses, it's a really quick and easy way of being able to bring that in as well. Okay, so let's move on to the next level, mid-level digital cinema. So what we're looking at here is kind of this mid-tier. So things are going to jump up in price. Before we were looking at, around, let's see, where were we back here? About $6,500 was our most expensive camera in the entry level, which very well could be mid-level. But here we are looking at our cheapest camera body. We're starting at around $6,000. So Red, within the last year, came out with the Red Komodo, which is their entry-level Red camera. So if you really love the look of Red cameras, Red's very popular in Hollywood. A lot of major movies have been shot on it. David Fincher shoots almost exclusively on the Red cameras. So if you saw Mank, that's a big awards movie this year, that was shot on Red. Not on the Komodo, however. Komodo came out fairly recently, but you get 6K RAW internal for $6,000. But keep in mind, all you get is that little box. Right? You need the lens, you need the monitor, you need the batteries, you need all that stuff to go along with it when you're trying to build out a Red package. Now, Red also introduces new cameras all the time. So the amount of time your Red will remain state-of-the-art is probably a little less than some of these other cameras we're going to be discussing. Blackmagic's option in this price bracket is the Ursa Mini Pro. The Ursa Mini Pro is really designed for actual single camera narrative shooting. So it's great if you are doing ENG style. So this is where you have the camera on your shoulder with the handles. You're walking around shooting, documentary interviews, kind of man on the street type of stuff. So it's a kind of a full functioning studio type camera. So this Ursa Mini Pro, you're looking at 4.6K RAW internal, $6,000 for the body. Moving on up, Sony has a couple options here as well. The Sony FS7 has been a very popular camera for a number of years. A lot of your news programs, a lot of documentaries are shot on the Sony A7 or Sony FS7. 4K video internal, looking at $8,000 for the body on that. FX9, an upgraded version of the FS7. Now you're up into the 6K range. No RAW, but 6K video, $11,000. Panasonic VariCam LT. This is again a great documentary camera. You're looking at 10 grand for just 4K internal. Now, what I love about Panasonic, why I say it's a great documentary camera, it has that form factor you want for being able to throw a camera on your shoulder, go out into the field, and also the color science, color management. I would put Panasonic up there with Canon, with Arri in terms of beautiful skin tones, beautiful color rendition in their captured images. When I get Panasonic footage coming in as a colorist, very little work I need to do to make things look beautiful. So that's a great option as well. And then Canon, a couple more options from Canon down here. The C300 Mark III, we're now up to 4K RAW internal. So the Mark III came out not too long ago, but you're looking at about 11K on the price range there. And then the C500 Mark II, which came out about a year and a half ago now, 6K RAW internal. So something to kind of put into consideration here, consider where we were back on the entry-level cameras, the Blackmagic Pocket 6K with 6K RAW internal. Then we jump up to this mid-level. And what is our best resolution in RAW? Well, the C500 Mark II, a $16,000 camera, 6K RAW, or the Red Komodo, a 6K RAW for $6 grand. So in terms of bang for your buck, that just kind of reinforces that whole idea behind the Blackmagic Pocket cameras. 6K RAW for $2,500, not too shabby. All right, let's talk about the big guys. Now, this is, if you're in the range where something like this you consider just like pocket change, then just give me a call, and I'm sure we can work out a deal. I'll come shoot your movie for you, no sweat. So a lot of these cameras, these are the good ones. These are really nice. This is what a lot of the Hollywood level movies or TV shows are being shot on these days. A lot of these also are probably going to be rental at this point. The idea of owning and running one of these camera systems as an individual is a significant investment. You'd have to kind of be on the Roger Deakins type level, or a cinematographer who's working regularly with a regular client who's always renting the cameras from the cinematographer to really kind of justify this as a business decision. But for Red, we got a couple options here. The Red Ranger Helium, an 8K RAW internal, 30 grand on the body for that. And then the Dragon X, which has been around a little bit longer. This has been on the market for a couple of years now. 6K RAW internal, 15,000 on the body there. So why would all of a sudden you pay double compared to the Komodo? The Dragon X has much nicer sensor than the Komodo. The Komodo is actually a much different camera sensor. So you're going to get better image quality out of the Dragon X as you would with the Komodo at a much cheaper price point. Sony Venice, this is kind of Sony's flagship digital cinema camera, looking at 6K RAW internal, 62,000 on the body for that. So it's not for the faint of heart, but a lot of commercials especially are shot on this camera. I've got to work with it in color correction a couple times. The quality of these images are phenomenal. It is by far and away the prettiest looking image Sony has ever put out. And that's just really has to do with the color science within the camera itself. All the specs hit the check marks. It's a really beautiful camera, but that price point is a little tricky for a lot of owner-operators. Canon C700, this is the flagship of Canon cinema line. 4K internal, 6K RAW external. So that kind of seems like a step back considering we were getting 6K RAW internal on the C500 Mark II down there in the bottom right. So the C700, I would suspect, is probably going to be due for an upgrade fairly soon. So we should be seeing a C700 Mark II, I would imagine, in the near future. Now, a company we haven't talked too much about thus far, Panavision. So Panavision, probably if you're familiar with the history of Hollywood, history of movie making, you know the company Panavision. They've been providing cameras and Technicolor and all that stuff for years and years and years. And then their foray into digital was this camera called the Genesis that maybe some of you are familiar with, came out about 10, 15 years ago. It was revolutionary at its time in terms of digital, but it was only HD. It didn't really last very long. It wasn't incredibly popular with the old school film cinematographers who were wanting to switch into digital. So it was fairly short-lived. So about 4 or 5 years ago, Panavision introduced their DXL camera, which was a collaboration they're doing with Red. So Red is providing the sensor, Red is providing a lot of the computer behind the sensor as well, but Panavision is putting it into a body designed for cinematographers, designed for narrative filmmaking. Now with everything Panavision, keep in mind, you can't buy anything Panavision. They are solely a rental company. So you can only rent their cameras, but a big benefit to renting a Panavision camera is you have the ability then to rent Panavision lenses. Panavision lenses only work on cameras that are provided by Panavision. They have their own very specific lens mount called a PV lens mount that is only on Panavision branded cameras that work with Panavision lenses. I would say by far and away the best lenses in the entire realm of cinematography and narrative filmmaking are Panavision lenses. Anamorphics, sphericals, you name it, beautiful. A lot of, probably your most beautiful, you think of them, some of the most beautiful movies of all time were shot on Panavision lenses. So that's a big benefit as well to rent a Panavision camera, is you get access to those lenses. But again, it's cost and availability. So Panavision has centers obviously in LA, I believe also in Chicago and New Orleans, Atlanta, New York. So it's in various places around the States. And they will send and ship gear to you as well. So if you're looking at a larger budget style production, Panavision also has programs for students and emerging filmmakers with grants, where you can apply for a grant, and if accepted, they will deck out your shoot with the latest and greatest gear and awesome lenses. So Panavision is a really great company, and something as you further your career into film should be a great relationship that you should look to build on. So last two formats, another company we haven't talked about for a while, Arri. So this is probably the quintessential Hollywood camera right now, is the Arri Alexa. So the Alexa Mini, very small form factor. I would say it's about the size of a small toaster, maybe even a little smaller. So an Alexa Mini, 4K RAW internal, $36,000. on the body for that, and that's not counting any lenses. The lens options, you can get a Canon mount on one of these. You can also use a PL mount. They also make adapters. But the image quality, the color management, the skin tones, all of that, amazing, beautiful. And then the Alexa large format. Here we go. Here's the big heavy hitter of this entire lecture, the large format. So what makes it large format? That has to do with sensor size, much bigger than 35 millimeter. So the Alexa large format is what a lot of, especially the latest Marvel movies, are all being shot on. I know a lot of you probably watched the season finale of WandaVision lately. No spoilers, but I think it's shot on the Alexa large format. So that kind of puts you at the level of what you should be expecting there. 4.5K raw internal. I mean, the resolution's not amazing. It's not 8K, 10K, 12K. So the specs aren't something that's totally going to blow you away, but it's about the quality of the image. That's what really blows people away when it comes to these Arri cameras. So that's what helps justify the cost point on a lot of this stuff. And it's a tried and true tool. It's used on the largest and the biggest and most demanding Hollywood productions happening right now. So that's what kind of makes it the kind of, I would say, the king of digital cinema cameras at this point. But all of these are great options: Red, Sony, Canon, Panavision. Okay, so we've gone through the different tiers now, starting with our smartphones, going up to the mirrorless DSLRs, entry, mid-level, high-end. Now here we are. So just to kind of bring us back to the central topic of this whole lecture of choosing the best camera to start your film career. If you can afford an Alexa large format, I would say that is a great camera to start your film career. But that's probably not really where a lot of people are at right now. So yeah, it's the best camera, you can afford all this stuff, but my hope is, in what you've learned here over the last couple hours, it should be a balance between art and technology, just like cinematography as a whole. Choosing the best camera isn't necessarily the one that has the most Ks. Isn't necessarily that has the one that's the biggest size sensor or shoots to the best compression. Because at the end of the day, when you're sitting on your couch watching a movie, or hopefully someday in a theater sitting there watching a movie, you're not thinking about any of that. You're thinking about the story. You're thinking about the visuals. You're thinking about how this whole aspect is coming together to transport you to somewhere else. The camera is a tool to transport you to somewhere else. So always approach it that way first, and then fill in the gaps with the technical stuff. A cinematographer's job is to balance the art and craft, is to balance the look with the tech. Now for directors, producers, you should be mostly focused on the art, on the look. So when you're looking to figure out, okay, what's the best camera for my production, start by looking at aesthetics. Start by looking at other movies that were shot on a camera like that. There's projects out there shot on all different kinds of cameras. So if you're interested in, okay, what does a Blackmagic camera really look like? Well, you can find movies that were shot on Blackmagic. There's a great website, I think if you Google, it's called like Shot on What, that will list what the camera types were for a lot of movie and TV productions that are in Hollywood today. So that's another great tool to kind of go back and look at camera aesthetics. So beyond just thinking about the camera as a whole, optics, lenses, and all this stuff, the optics are a huge part of visual storytelling, the quality of your lenses. Now, DSLRs, Canon lenses, Nikon lenses have a particular look to them. Panavision lenses have a particular look. Zeiss lenses have a look to them. So this is another area I strongly recommend looking to invest time and resources in. Because as I said in the very beginning, lenses last way beyond whatever the current camera system is. I've been using my Nikon lenses for close to 10 to 15 years now, and they've gone on 4 or 5 different kinds of cameras. And I know that look, and I know what I can achieve with those particular lenses. So investing in lenses of your own, whether they be zoom lenses, prime lenses, I think that's a great starting off point as well. And then also lighting. The other thing we haven't really touched on that much in this lecture, but it's obviously a crucial part of cinematography. Because for me, you can have the Arri Alexa large format with the best looking lenses possible, But if you just have broad, basic, hard lighting and it's not interesting, it doesn't further advance the story, and it just doesn't look very nice, no one cares what camera you shot on. So lighting is as well a crucial element of visual storytelling, and something that should be very, very much thought of if you're looking to build out your kit. It's nice to have a couple lights you can take with you on location that can be hard lights or soft lights being used for keys or backgrounds or edge lights, all of these different aspects of lighting. And there are great classes here at UCLA Extension that go over ways to achieve cinematic lighting, even at the very basic level. Our Intro to Cinematography class is a great way to kind of get your feet wet with cinematic lighting. And then beyond that, there's a class called Lighting for Emotional Impact, which is exactly as the title leads on, ways to utilize lighting for that portion of visual storytelling. Camera is a portion of it, obviously, but lighting and camera together with the final act of post-production and color correction, that's how our final images are being created. That's ultimately the ingredients that are going into the final soup. Another good aspect, right? We're talking about big investments here. We're talking about spending a lot of money. There was only one camera on this list that was under $1,000. That's can be steep for a lot of people, especially now. So a way to think about cameras is, yeah, with all that business stuff aside, this is still a hobby. It's a passion. You're investing in something that at the end of the day should make you happy, right? Not to go all like Marie Kondo, like find joy in objects and things like that. Does the Sony a7S bring you joy? So beyond just that, like you're investing in something that's going to help further your career, something that's going to be the starting off point to what is hopefully a very successful and productive career of telling visual stories. That's what's led us all to this point of wanting to be filmmakers, is having stories to tell and being passionate about the medium, being passionate about the art. That's why I'm here talking to you right now. I mean, I'm not just here with a guy who knows a bunch of numbers and making you do math on a Saturday. We're doing it because we love what we do. We love being filmmakers. We love telling these stories, and the camera is a crucial part of that. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a tool that you need to really have that deep connection with. So pick something that you know is going to bring you joy. An Alexa large format brings me a lot of joy. Just saying. In case there's anyone, are looking for an early Christmas present, just send it my way. More important than specs, how you use it creatively, because that's like what we've been talking about. Those are the aspects of visual storytelling and the end goal in a lot of this. The tech is important. The art is more important. So I hope that's your one big takeaway with a lot of this, is to examine the creative aspects of the camera first, then start to dive into those tech specs. I see it with students all the time where people get so caught up in the tech specs, right? They're going through the spec sheet and they just want to know, okay, tell me about bit depth, color compression, color subsampling, 444 versus 422, all this stuff. And that's the stuff I teach in a lot of my extension classes. But at the end of the day, does it make you a better filmmaker? Maybe, maybe not. What does is how you take those technical concepts and apply them to a creative end result. Apply them to the creative end goal. And that's what I hope to achieve, and a lot of our cinematography classes here at Extension hope to achieve as well, of provide you with the tools. In this case, the tools are knowledge. Using that knowledge towards your next production, whether you're a director or producer, or you work in development or audio or whatever, using the tools that you can learn and be taught in a class. Once you get on set and you get your hands on some gear, you get some hands on lenses, cameras, and all that, and then let your creativity run wild. That's what we're trying to achieve here, to enable your creativity. So hopefully through this lecture today, talking about some of the best camera options available and what constitutes a good camera, has piqued a lot of your interest of, oh, I didn't really think about that aspect of camera or that. So hopefully this can be a good starting off point towards investing in a camera and furthering your creative career as a visual storyteller. And I'm very pleased to have played maybe just a small role in that. Okay, so that's the end of my song and dance. Let's see, I know we got a bunch of questions queued up, so I'm gonna go ahead and go through here. We've kind of broken up some of the questions into more like categories about technical and practical and all this stuff. So I'll start to work through some of these questions that we have all queued up. So we have a question from Inur about, what about color grading with images on the smartphone? They record 8-bit in general, iPhone 12 Pro Max has 10-bit and it is quite new. So, great question. How bit rate coordinates with quality in post? Well, like we talked about with bit rate, 8-bit is only 256 shades of gray, 256 shades of red, green, and blue. That's quite limiting. If the camera is only recording that amount of information, once that information moves into color correction, that's all I have to work with, is just in that little bowl of color. If you're able to record 10-bit at 10,024 shades of red, green, and blue, and I take that into color, a lot more flexibility about what you can do with it in post. Now, for me, the biggest advantage, like we did in the demo with Filmic Pro, is that I can use a log curve. So even though 8-bit, it is what it is, 8-bit is what it is, putting that log curve on will give me more dynamic range and really help my ability to work with this image in post-production. Also the compression, because if you have an 8-bit camera that's highly compressed, this is one of my big critiques about GoPro. We haven't talked that much about GoPro. Normally GoPro is like a dirty word in a lot of my classes. If I need just a camera to make fun of, I'll usually make fun of GoPros. But GoPro's technology, highly compressed, 8-bit. Their idea of resolution is a little strange, but cameras like that really kind of fall apart quickly in post. But having better compression, like through Filmic Pro, having a log curve, like through Filmic Pro, I don't actually work for Filmic Pro, even though it might sound like it. All these types of things are going to be really helpful when you move on into post. Okay, so we have another question from Jen about what is tint on white balance and why is it better to keep it at 0? Great question. So with white balance in general, that's like what I was doing earlier, where you tell your camera what is white light. So if white light, in this case, I'm using daylight balanced lighting to come in to kind of help color balance the color temperature of the TV itself. So I'm using daylight light, so that's what I'm setting in white balance. Now there's a separate element of tint. Tint is plus minus green. So when you're tinting an image, you're either making it more green or less green. Under most instances, you're going to leave that around 0. But where tint can be very helpful is when you're shooting on a practical location and let's say you don't have the ability to bring in a ton of lighting. You're needing to use the available lighting on, at the location and it's older fluorescent tubes or things like that. Well, traditional, like regular residential or commercial fluorescents are very green to cameras. So how I can get around that is by adjusting the tint in my camera to dial out that green by doing a minus tint. And that's going to help balance out that natural greenness that I'm getting from the fluorescence on site. So most of the time I like to leave my tint at 0, but there are some instances when you go on location where it could be a really helpful tool to bail you out of a tricky situation. Okay, we got another question here from Wesley. Would you recommend the Blackmagic 6K looking to upgrade from a 5D Mark II? It would absolutely be an upgrade, and I believe in my whole little song and dance that maybe I was shilling a little bit too hard for Blackmagic, but as someone who owns a Blackmagic 6K myself, I would say absolutely that would be an upgrade over the 5D Mark II. You're getting 6K, you're getting RAW. With the Blackmagic 6K, you can also record ProRes, so you don't necessarily have to record RAW. You could just do ProRes. It has log built in, it has audio options built in, a lot of video tools as well, like a histogram, zebras, false color, things like that, different exposure tools. So I think it would be a major upgrade because you're really advancing from something that's built for stills into something now built for video. And that's really going to further your career in film rather than trying to fit the square peg into the round hole that is a stills camera that has a video option. Okay, we got a question here from Alexander. What would you recommend in this case? Shooting documentaries, lots of field trips with tough or very simple conditions. Priorities are affordable price, buy instead of rent, high mobility, shoot on the run, compact size, battery life, high compression rate. All right, quite the shopping list. Let's see. So for documentaries, yep, you're definitely going to need the long compression. You're going to need a battery that lasts a long time. Affordable price, because there are some really nice options out there that are in that little higher price bracket. As we talked about with some of the mid and high-end cameras, like the VariCam LT is a wonderful camera that does absolutely everything you're wanting to do except for the price. So that's an option as well. I would probably stay away from red. Arri has an option that we didn't talk about here called the Amira camera, A-M-I-R-A camera. But again, that price point is probably going to be way outside of your price range for something like this. So I would say a really good option to consider, and now this may or may not be in your price range, would be the Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro. So the Ursa Mini Pro is the more studio style Blackmagic camera. I believe the price point was around like 5 to 7K, something in that range. Super 35 size sensor, can have EF lenses on it, pretty common lens mount, interchangeable batteries. You can actually go to what, we didn't talk too much about batteries, but Anton Bauer, V-mount, these larger capacity batteries that will last potentially all day with something like this. So you can put those on that camera as well. You get the 4.6K RAW as well. You could record ProRes. You can do audio on board as well. You can have an onboard camera mic, which might be really helpful for your application. You can also run like a lavalier mic into it as well. So you can have 2 channels of audio running at all times. Has the flip out LCD. So it has a monitor built in, which is nice. So it's a really nice form factor for throwing a camera on your shoulder, having that flip out LCD right in front of you, or you can rotate it to see around it if you ever need. But you have essentially one hand on the lens and you're able to operate, move around, get good quality audio. So I think that might be a really good option to look at. The only drawback is, like we talked about in general with Blackmagic, their color science is really new. So the look of those cameras sometimes leaves a little bit to be desired. So what I would recommend in that case is brush up on some skills of post-color editing, or ways maybe get some test footage shot on the Blackmagic Ursa Mini. That would be a great camera to do like a little try demo where you can rent it for a small job, just so you get some hands-on experience. You start to work with the footage, process it on your own in either Adobe programs or like DaVinci Resolve, for instance, and just get a feel of if you like it or not. Because it does take, especially for documentary on the shoulder, you need to be very quick and agile. I shoot a lot of feature documentaries myself, and that's one of the main things I look for in a camera is I need to be able to make on-the-fly, quick exposure decisions, lighting decisions, changing camera settings with rapidly changing conditions. I need to have all those at my fingertips and be able to quickly translate what I need to do to what is on the camera itself. If I ever have to go into a menu to change something, that's a negative in my book. Because if I'm live on the field, I've shot a nature documentary where we're on long lenses filming these endangered birds, and the bird might take off at any moment. We want to get that epic slow-mo shot of the bird flying off into the horizon. And if I'm in a camera menu, fitzing around, well, I've missed the shot. So I need to have everything at my fingertips with a button or a knob or things like that ready to go at a moment's notice. So the Ursa Mini Pro has that. On Canon, that might also be an option as well. Their C200 or C300 line might be another alternative to look at. Okay, so we have a question here from Carolina. What waterproof camera would you recommend to shoot underwater in the Pacific Ocean? Well, I actually have a list of cameras only approved for the Pacific Ocean, not the Atlantic. That's a whole separate list. I'm just kidding. So with waterproof cameras, this is kind of a tricky situation because all the cameras we've talked about so far, except for smartphones, are not really waterproof. But the thing you can look into, and I highly recommend for underwater photography, is an underwater housing. So I've shot in a couple of the feature films I've worked on. I've done some underwater work. I mean, I did underwater work back in film school with a Bolex 16mm crank camera, where we cranked it up, put it in an underwater housing. You could only roll for about 45 seconds at a time with 16mm running through it. So we would crank it up, it's like a spring operated. There was no battery. You put it in the housing, you go under, and you can hear it on the water go click, 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 and that's when it stopped recording. Get it up out of the water, get a breath of air. Dark ages. But nowadays with digital, there is underwater housings for pretty much all of these cameras we've talked about so far that are made specifically for housing these kinds of cameras. I've taken Arri Alexa Minis underwater. I've taken Red cameras underwater, where you put it in the housing and then it has different controls on the outside that are all waterproof, so you can zoom, you can control focus. You can't really control much in terms of camera settings. You have to kind of set that before you go under. but there are some that even have waterproof touch LCDs where you could change camera menu settings. So I would say first and foremost, think about what camera you want to own based on all the stuff we've talked about so far. And then, with that said, then look at underwater housings, because more than likely there's a housing for that particular camera, but you want to have all those things checked off creatively, technically first before you start worrying about, oh, can I take it under or not? Get the best possible image you can, best you can afford, best you want to have. And then there's all these options out there through third-party vendors. Hydroflex, I think, is one of those that makes underwater housings. They're actually based here in El Segundo in LA. And then there's another big company I'm forgetting right now. I was not ready to talk underwater cinematography, but yet here we are. So hopefully, sounds like a really awesome shoot, and wish you best of luck with it. Okay, so we got a question now from Chris. Can you quickly address the Sony Option Alpha 1 8K versus the FX9 6K full frame body only? Good question. So the big thing that stands out to me first and foremost with those cameras is you're kind of comparing apples and oranges to a certain extent. The Alpha 1 is a mirrorless camera. So that is going to be your small form factor, kind of designed for stills and whatnot. Now the video capabilities are amazing. And then the other larger option, the FX model, that's going to be something designed for actual video use. So it's going to be a much larger camera body, but have all of those options built in for being able to control settings on the fly, do internal audio, time code, all that fun stuff. Just like I was talking about with the earlier question of having a camera on your shoulder for documentary, all those options are right there for you. They're buttons on the camera body itself where you can use ND filters, you can change ISO, you can change all this stuff, white balance on the fly. And it's really a camera designed for video. So putting aside resolution and compression and all that stuff, if you're someone who's going to be shooting a lot of video or documentary or working with a primarily video, I would tend to go the direction of the FX line. But if you are passionate about stills and you're going to be using it as stills as well, or maybe you've had DSLR cameras in the past or mirrorless cameras before, the Sony Alpha might be an easier transition for you into higher quality video, yet still keeping you in the lane of stuff you're already familiar with, rather than making that big jump into standalone video. Okay, another question from Jen, is the Blackmagic Pocket good enough to make a documentary for a streaming service like Netflix? Yes, absolutely. Now, I saw this going around in the chat as well. Netflix has a list of approved cameras. Now, a Netflix approved camera, this, for most of us, doesn't really apply unless you're being hired by Netflix to create original content for Netflix. That's where that camera list comes from. Now, when Netflix is looking to acquire content, so let's say you've made a feature documentary on your own that's an indie and they're looking to acquire it, or you're through a sales agent or something and you're selling your movie to Netflix to host on their service, at that point they don't really care what camera you shot on. It can be HD, it can be 4K. If you go through a lot of the content on Netflix, there is still a lot of HD content on Netflix. So as long as the camera can shoot a native 4K, so by native 4K, that means coming off the sensor is a true 4K signal, then it's on Netflix approved camera list. So we don't necessarily need to make a huge deal out of whether it's on the list or not as you're looking to buy something for yourself. But it's something to keep in mind. And if you're hired by Netflix to shoot their next awesome original content, then yes, you'll be picking off of their list of native 4K. The good news is almost all the cameras, with the exception of a couple, would qualify as a Netflix camera, that they all have 4K internal. Maybe, yeah, you wouldn't be able to shoot on like a Canon Rebel T7. That's not going to be on the list. The Canon C100, not going to be on the list. C200 actually is not on the list, but for an odd reason, because it doesn't have internal timecode. That's another thing that can knock you off of Netflix's list. So things to keep in mind, but yeah, I saw the link for that list go through in the chat, so definitely check that out as well. Blackmagic Pocket would definitely be on that list. So Carolina had a question. What's the camera with the best dynamic range in the entry-level selection? So for the entry-level selection, let me jump back here a little bit into our entry-level digital cinema cameras. So all of these have log, right? All these have some type of log curve in them. Now log, like we talked about earlier, that's what's providing all this extended dynamic range for us. So the FX3 is going to have Sony's S-Log built in. Blackmagic has what they call Blackmagic Film, which is their log curve. Panasonic has V-Log for like Victory, V-Log. I have no idea how they got there. And then Canon has their Canon Log 2, Canon Log 3. So all of these are going to have extended dynamic range. In my Becoming Camera Savvy class, we actually test the Blackmagic Pocket 6K compared to the Sony a7S. We even throw in an old Canon 5D for good measure. We're also testing it against the C500 Mark II. We have a RED camera in there as well. So as part of that, I'm testing dynamic range all the time. The Blackmagic cameras in RAW actually hold up pretty well. The Canon cameras, it's funny, the C200 will have more dynamic range than the C100. It's a slightly better sensor, and you get that RAW, which is going to increase your dynamic range. So for me, what I would look for most is, yes, I need to have RAW, and then beyond that, you really have to test it. So this might be a great opportunity to test and rent maybe some of these other options just for a day or a weekend. Take it into, shoot outside in a park, shoot inside at your place, and just get a sense of how much range you're really working with and which one looks most cinematic to you. Because at the end of the day, the dynamic range isn't all that different between a lot of cameras in this class. So I think the more indicative category to look at is going to be aesthetics and do you like the images that it creates? So that'll be something to keep in mind with a lot of these in the entry level. Okay, so we got a question now from Michelle. For an on-camera journalist creating their own interview series from home, good luck, who needs to operate their own camera, can you compare the Sony a6600 with a Sigma 16 lens to the Blackmagic Pocket 4K? Need something affordable that can capture great cinematic B-roll in the field. Also, do you think using iPhone Max with Filmic Pro for B-Cam as a multi-camera remote interview work well? Or as a recommendation for B-Cam for one of those main cams? All great questions. Okay, so I'm not that familiar with the a6600. I believe that's probably in their DSLR Alpha line. So we're again kind of comparing apples and oranges to a certain extent of a DSLR compared to an actual video camera. So with the video camera, like a Blackmagic Pocket 4K, that's going to have a lot of video features, exposure tools, audio, internal, things like that that are really going to help elevate the look. And not to mention, having that nice large sensor size, in this case, 35mm size sensor, will make it look a little bit more cinematic. That was part of the way I record videos and do Zoom calls and stuff like that. I try to hook up an external camera with a 35 size sensor so it looks like people are looking at me in a movie for a lot of this stuff, right? You got to take yourself serious as a filmmaker, even if it's still over Zoom. So that might be a great option as well. But then for a B camera, the iPhone with Filmic Pro could work in certain aspects. The problem is going to be matching. So even though it has log, it has all these different functions, it's not going to be a perfect one-to-one match with what you have as your A cam. The only real perfect match is to have an identical camera as your B cam. So the good news with the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, the price point, pretty low. So maybe that's an option to just have the same camera to do A cam, B cam. I would say if you need to go down a level a little bit, then maybe look into the BMD Micro, because you can get an external monitor for it that'll probably be, $100, $100 to $200 for the real low end ones. It's just an HDMI out from that camera into the monitor so you can see what you're recording. Same lens mount, so you can take lenses and put them on this micro camera as well. It records internal. Now, since you're going to broadcast, 4K really probably isn't that big of a criteria, because a lot of broadcast stuff is still HD. So the HD limitations of this micro might be okay. There's also a version of the micro out there, I believe, that got released not too long ago that does have the 4K option as well. So if you're going Blackmagic as your A cam, try to keep it in the Blackmagic family in general, and that'll just make your life so much easier when it comes to matching later on. Okay, so we got a question here from Yuri, and I guarantee I'm killing most of your names right now. Trust me, as a Knutzen, I am very much used to it, and I apologize. So Yuri, what about an iPhone 12 Pro with Filmic versus a Sony a7S? Would Sony really be worth the investment versus the last iPhone with Filmic? So with those technical categories that we talked about, the very first one, sensor size. This is the big difference between the A7S and the iPhone. What is the sensor size of the iPhone? Well, it's smaller than your pinky thumbnail, like significantly smaller. It is a tiny, 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 tiny sensor. Now, with those smaller sensors, it's really hard to get that cinematic depth of field. And also you're going to get a lot of noise and low light. It's not going to be super ideal for extreme exposure instances. So the small sensor, even paired with Filmic Pro is helping kind of take you to that next level of giving you a lot of the video options, giving you a lot more manual video options, but you can never really get around that sensor issue compared to the Sony a7S that has a sensor that's even larger than Super 35. Right? We talked about the Alexa large format as this $100,000 camera. Well, the Sony a7S, their sensor really isn't all that smaller than what you're getting in a $100,000 camera. Cinematic depth of field, better light sensitivity, pretty good performance in low light. The internal compression, not super great, but again, it's not super great on an iPhone either. So the a7S, I think, would still for sure be an upgrade over iPhone, but you can still great looking stuff on an iPhone. And if cost is a concern, then I would say start there, and then over time in your career, you can maybe advance and level up to something like an a7S down the road. Okay, a question here from Shirley. What's the biggest difference between the higher end stills camera with good video, like a Canon R5, and an entry-level cinema camera, Blackmagic 6K? That's a great question and brings us into a topic I didn't really talk all that much about, megapixels. So when you're looking at stills cameras, this is one of those things on that spec sheet, are megapixels. How many megapixels is the sensor? Well, megapixels doesn't really equate to much in the digital cinema camera world, so that's why we kind of glossed over most of it. But where megapixels make a huge difference is in stills. So on like a Canon R5, the quality of the stills that camera can capture is amazing. It's really, really great. So if you find yourself as a filmmaker or someone who needs to be taking stills as well as video, then the R5, by all means. The Blackmagic Pocket does not have a stills option. It's just kind of a video only. Now, that's not to prevent you from going into the video and extracting frames as stills. You can certainly do that as well. A little less than ideal in some instances, but the resolution is going to be wildly different. On an R5 with a still, you're looking at things that are 16K and beyond or somewhere around there, compared to the Blackmagic Pocket 4K where you're dealing with 4K resolution. Now, resolution in stills makes a huge difference. Think about the images you see on billboards and print advertisement. Those require extreme high resolution source images in order to blow it up that big or to use it in those different kinds of formats. Extracting a still from video, not as much. It's not going to hold up in a lot of the applications where we would generally be using regular still photography at a very high megapixel. Okay, question here from Jessica. Can you talk about the external recorder that can be used with cameras? Does it add weight to the camera or how is it affixed? Talk more about mounts, their differences and functions. All right, Jessica wants to get into the nitty gritty here, talking about recorders and weight. Yes, they add weight for sure, right? They're not completely weightless. That would be amazing. Although we are getting to that point with cloud-based recording. As like in my DIT class for extension, we spend a whole week talking about the future of the industry, the future of technology, the future of cameras and all that stuff. And one thing to really keep your eye on coming in the I would say not too near future, but it's around the corner. We won't be recording inside our cameras at all. There will be no internal compression. There will be no internal recording mechanism. The cameras will be able to connect over a 5G, 6G, a wireless signal to the wireless network we already have established and be able to record straight to a cloud-based server. So instead of having a physical memory card, you hit the red button and that is getting streamed to a data site in Yuma, Arizona in a server room. And that is where your footage is actually being stored. And you can go to your computer, you can download it, it's immediately backed up because it was sent up to the cloud. So cloud-based recording is something that I would keep an eye on because I think it's going to make a lot of sense in the filmmaking industry, especially for on location and things like that. So with external recorders in general, some of the big brands, like the one I mentioned before was Atomos, A-T-M-O-S or something like that. So they have a whole wide array of external recorders. Now these recorders connect to the camera either over an HDMI or SDI connection. So you got to make sure your camera has those options available to you. Other things, they all require power. So you have to actually power that external monitor or external recorder. So that could be through a repurposed camera battery, that could be AC power. So that's also something to keep in mind, is that's going to require batteries. So you have the cable going in, you got the batteries powering it. So all of that is going to add some weight and just general, just kind of bulkiness to your camera rig. I prefer not to use an external recorder unless I have a really good reason to do so, just because it adds so much weight to the camera rig. In some instances, makes it kind of bulky, offside and all that stuff. But I'm sure maybe some of you have seen these really funny pictures of like a Sony a7S, a very small camera in a giant camera rig, where the camera rig's like this big, but the camera itself's just that. That's what we're in. As the cameras get smaller, the accessories are not getting smaller along with it. So that's something to keep in mind. So when connecting and physically mounting it to your camera rig, there's these things called Noga arms that are kind of arms that we use in camera rigs that screw in to something called a cheese plate. That's essentially a piece of metal that has a bunch of holes drilled in it. So you would attach the arm to this cheese plate. They call it a cheese plate because it looks like a slice of Swiss cheese. There you go, see, letting you inside behind the curtain. So it screws into that cheese plate, connects over the arm to the external monitor, so it's physically mounted and you can change the position of it within your camera rig. Okay, we got another question from Ara. Are lens mounts on Blackmagic 6K mountable on Sony FX3? Not really. So the lens mount, like on a Blackmagic Pocket 6K, that mount is part of the camera system. You can't actually take it off. Right, so that camera mount is going to be what's called a Canon EF mount in most instances, that is designed to accept Canon lenses. So you can't take it off and put it on a different camera. That mount is kind of baked into that whole kind of build of that camera. Now there's some that have mounts that you can take off and move around, like Arri has some, Sony has some. But with a Sony camera, those most likely are going to be Sony's alpha mount. Sony's actual kind of specific lens mount. So if you want to use Canon lenses on a Sony camera, you're going to require some type of adapter to make that happen. So those adapters, Metabones is the name of a company that makes some really great adapters to help convert from like Canon lenses to a Sony camera body. B&H has a bunch of different adapters that you can purchase, and some of them are fairly inexpensive. The more expensive ones are going to have some type of electronics inside of them, because the thing with Canon lenses is they require electronic control to control the aperture. And if you want to add autofocus for any reason, again, that's an electronic process. So once you get into electronic adapters, the price is going to go way up. That's why I like my Nikon lenses. Everything's manual. Okay, a question from Galen. Would you ever recommend buying a used camera? Wow, that's a really good point. I should have put that in there. So with used cameras, there are instances where, yes, maybe a used camera makes a lot of sense. So when I'm looking at a camera that is used, and this is the same approach I take when I'm getting ready to shoot a movie and I'm at a rental house. Because think of it, when you're renting a camera, even from a rental house, you're essentially working with a used camera. So there are certain types of quality checks I'm going to do with that system before I take it in the field and start shooting a movie with it. So first thing I'm going to look at, and this is usually buried deep in the menus, is number of hours it's been used, or number of hours it's been turned on. Because when we think about the cameras, remember the sensor, right? Light is falling through the lens on this sensor. This is a photosensitive piece of electronics. The more hours that light is falling on that sensor, it's going to start to change characteristics, right? Just like if you've left your car out in the California sun for too long, the paint's going to start to fade over time. You're going to start to lose some of that color because of the harsh effects of sunlight. So the more hours a camera has been used in the field, the more likely that sensor has started to fade or change characteristics a little bit. So I would always go through and make sure it doesn't have a ton of hours on it. And even if it does, then really test it. Shoot a lot of tests on it to make sure you're fully comfortable with the quality of image that's coming out of that camera. Now, another option when it comes to used cameras, if you're looking to buy, is that there are camera places here in town that will charge you a small fee to do a technical evaluation for you of a used camera, where you can take a camera that someone's trying to sell to you, take it to them, they'll put it through its paces, they'll test it in-house and let you know if anything at all is wrong with it. Part of the beauty of living in Los Angeles, Panasonic is here, Red is here, Arri is here, all the big camera houses are here, and for the most part will do tests like that for you. So I would recommend reaching out to them as well, and that might be a good resource to make sure you're not getting something that is damaged goods. Okay, a question from Chris. A quick question on Sony, an older Sony camera that can shoot RAW, the FS700. Oh, the FS700. Definitely an older camera. I have a little bit of experience with that Sony FS700. I didn't put it in here because it is a little bit out of date in terms of its specs, but what really advanced it and made it kind of revolutionary for its time is that you could connect it to an external recorder and get RAW. It was pretty much one of the first ones that offered RAW externally. So you're able to record in RAW and shoot extremely high frame rates. So the FS700, which is one, this is probably 8-9 years ago, I would use as a high-speed camera when I was shooting a Red or Alexa as my A or B camera. So I was bringing that one on just because it could shoot RAW in 4K at extremely high frame rates. I think if you went down to 2K, you could get something obscene like 900 frames per second or something like that. So it was a really great camera back in its day. So where it kind of falls flat now a little bit is in log and quality of RAW. Sony has improved their log curves and their RAW recording specs quite a bit since that camera came out. So it's a little out of date in terms of the creative side of it, but some of the features and specs of that camera are really unparalleled still to this day. So if you can find a great deal on it, I would caution it as being a camera you can use for a long time coming up into the future, but any camera is better than no camera, and it has a great feature set. So I'm a fan of that. I'm a fan of the FS700. Takes me down memory lane. Okay, so a question from Elizabeth. Can you recommend a company in Los Angeles to have a DSLR sensor cleaned? Yes, Canon, right? If you have a Canon DSLR, Canon has a facility in Burbank. They have a full tech facility as well where you can bring in your Canon camera. I think they charge a small fee or whatever and will do a complete clean out of it. Professional photographers in town, I would say Canon probably is the standard when it comes to professional stills photography. So Canon offers a service to all photographers to bring in their cameras, and Canon will do a technical clean out, maintenance on them. And living in LA, it's a great possibility because they're just up in Burbank. So definitely check out Canon's Center in Burbank. It's kind of right off of, kind of as you're heading to Glendale, kind of near Warner Brothers and that area of Burbank. So check it out. Okay, so we had a follow-up now from Alexander. His question was about shooting documentaries and the documentary rigs. So his follow-up is, does it also apply to Blackmagic Pocket 6K? So for Blackmagic Pocket 6K, you're looking at a very different form factor. So with the Blackmagic 6K, it's going to be a smaller camera, more of a DSLR style, that is not a full studio camera. So to access a lot of the tools and options on the Blackmagic 6K, you still need to go into the touchscreen menu on the back. I think the camera itself only has like 4 or 5 buttons on it at all. So everything else is through that touchscreen menu. So the thing with me and touchscreens, especially as it relates to documentary and taking a camera on location, I actually hate touchscreens with a passion. You take them out on location, it's windy, it's dusty, it's bright, the sun is glaring on it, it has reflection to it. If it starts to rain, you got to immediately cover it up, and now, or if it's cold, you're trying to use gloves and it's a LCD and the LCD is liquid and it gets colder, it doesn't respond quite as well. Touchscreens are annoying, but hey, they look cool. So I personally hate having touchscreens on the field. So that, for me, would be kind of a drawback of using the Pocket 6K in some of the conditions you're talking about. But image sensor-wise, quality-wise, yeah, you're getting 6K, you're getting RAW. You'll still be getting RAW with the Ursa Mini Pro, but it is a smaller form factor, so you might need a little bit more to build out the camera rig rather than the Ursa Mini Pro that's pretty much ready to go right off the bat. But for that cost difference, maybe the accessories of what you need to rig it out might ultimately equal the cost of the Ursa Mini Pro. So that's something you can consider. Okay, so a follow-up here of Jin, is timecode recording a must for indie documentary for Netflix? I don't really need to sync up other audio myself. So with this, for the Netflix original stuff, they require timecode also for their archiving. So beyond just delivering the film to them, and this is something I get into working in post-production and deliverables and all this stuff, that when you make a movie that's like a Netflix original, and I've had the opportunity to work on a couple of those, once you shoot it, you edit it, you finish it, and you're delivering the final movie, that's just one aspect of the stuff Netflix wants. They also want all of the raw footage. All that raw footage, usually on what's called an LTO tape or something kind of like a hard drive, and that's getting sent to Netflix, and that goes into their vault. The reason they're doing that is that if they ever need to go back and pull clips or pull new footage or do a, whatever they do, like a recap show or who knows. I mean, yeah, you're talking about an indie doc, so it's probably not super relevant, but they need to have access to all that raw footage. The way they're able to connect what you used in your edit back to that raw footage is through timecode. So that's why timecode is an important aspect of what they require. Now, if you're fully indie and you're not doing this like as a Netflix original or in partnership with them, then shoot, timecode doesn't matter, right? If you can sync audio yourself, do any of that, because for the stuff that is not Netflix owned, the only thing they're gonna want is the final movie. And at that point, they're never going back to the RAWs. They're not caring if the RAWs have timecode or not. So it's kind of irrelevant at that point. So if you're making something with the intention of trying to get it on Netflix or Amazon or whatever, then yeah, timecode doesn't really matter. The C100 could be a good option. C200 could be a good option as well. The Blackmagic cameras both have timecode as well. Even if you shoot on a mirrorless that doesn't have timecode, you could use that as well. Okay, so we had a follow-up again from Jessica, was talking about external recorders, talking about the different kind of mounts and their differences and how they function differently. So mounts, I would assume we're talking about lens mounts. So with a lens mount, the lens mount is specific to the type of lens that you're trying to put on that camera, whether it's Canon or Nikon or Sony. Those have specific types of, and I'm talking about the actual layout of the pins on the back of the lens itself, how we're connecting that physically to the camera. So Canon mounts, like I talked about earlier, are entirely digital. That's how you control aperture. Nikon lenses are mechanical, so it actually has like a little lever inside the mount. That's how you control the f-stop. Sony lenses, again, are entirely digital, like Canon. So those are some of the types of differences you might run into in terms of the mount itself. But for me, it's most important to mount or to match the lens you want to use or the lens you own with the mount of the specific camera you're trying to use. And that's where adapters might come into play or things like that. Just because you have a Blackmagic camera with a Canon mount and you want to put Nikon lenses on it, there's adapters you can get for less than $100 that enable you to do that. Okay, so a question here from Anna. Would you consider doing a sequel to this lecture about lenses and external recorders? Really interesting to know more about how you can elevate it. Not so easy to end up spending on not so ideal options. I hear you. So a great, and this is again my shameless plug, a great sequel will be Becoming Camera Savvy class being offered in summer quarter 2021 here at UCLA Extension. That's a class I'm actually offering right now in winter quarter. That's a full 11 weeks where we do deep dives into lenses, deep dives into external recorders, and I think that would be a perfect option for you as we go much deeper into the specifics of the camera system itself and going into more specifics about recorders and a whole deep dive on lenses, optics, all this fun stuff that I geek out on way too much. But I hope this little camera seminar has been really helpful to kind of just get you the basics of the camera and then hopefully interest you in moving forward, taking the next steps here. So for Christina has a question here. The Blackmagic 6K is only good depending on lens. What lens would you recommend for shallow depth of field? Great question. So obviously lenses add a lot to the quality of your, to the image that's being recorded. That's why there's cheap lenses and like crazy expensive Zeiss and anamorphic lenses. All of these have different visual characteristics that you ultimately need to pair to the visual aesthetics you're trying to achieve in your particular project. So for shallow depth of field, a longer lens, like more telephoto lens, is going to be key for getting that shallow depth of field look. So something like a zoom lens that can go up to 100 millimeter or 200 millimeter type of lens, that's what's going to give you a much shallower depth of field to work with. Typically wider angle lenses, like anything that's, let's say, a 24 millimeter lens all the way down to like a 16 or 8 millimeter lens, those are going to have very deep depth of field. So that might be something to kind of avoid. The sensor itself in the Blackmagic 6K is Super 35 sized. So that's your standard cinematic sensor for getting that kind of depth of field, but a longer lens is going to help you with that. Just keep in mind, it's more telephoto. So maybe you need to back the camera farther away. It's going to create really tight close-ups because it's so telephoto once you get into the 100 millimeter, 200 millimeter style lenses, but you'll have that super shallow cinematic depth of field. If you really are wanting to achieve that particular look, I would recommend looking at a larger sensor camera. Something like a, let's see here, it would be like a Sony, like the Sony a7S. That will help you get a much larger field of view and therefore more shallow depth of field. Okay, so we're kind of right up on the time here. So thank you everyone for your great questions. And I hope to see some of you potentially in some upcoming classes here at UCLA Extension. I hope you've had a great time going through all of this with me and kind of listening to my little song and dance and my silly, terrible jokes. And thank you to my stand-ins, the cat and the wheel. So thank you all for coming. Now, if you ever want to follow up with other questions, things like that, the way to get in contact with me is you can reach out to me on my website. So if you just go to jasonknutzen.com, so my name should be plastered all over this thing, so I know the spelling's a little tricky. But if you go to my website, there's a contact page, and you can go and type your questions, and that will find its way to me so that I'll be able to answer any follow-up questions you might have. I know we had a lot of people here, maybe not time to get to all the questions. So, but I thank you all for your participation, and glad to help you take that next step in your film career.